on that. But those are the things that concern me anyway. And we just don't know a lot of information about this. It seems like it just was sprung up all of a sudden and without a whole lot of policy directive.
Madam Chairman, I believe we're good now.
Okay. Thank you. Welcome back to the world. We apologize for our technical delay, but we have returned from lunch and we are going to pick up 21 LSO 0180 Mental Health Professions Practice Act amendments. And I'm going to turn chairing over to Senator Baldwin temporarily. So for this bill and the next, so that people can ask questions and I don't have to call on them and answer at the same time. Okay, so I'll just give a little overview of this and the next together. I'm actually kind of excited about these two bills. Those of you who've been on committee longer, we worked on these issues in Evanston, and I think those of you who are on the term before that, I think we're even working on them before that. And personally, I feel a little bit, well, after Evanston and the session, I felt like we had left a lot of things hanging out there that needed tidying up. There were some contentious parts, but there were some parts that were really cleanup. And so what I have tried to do is put together, and I'm doing them in two bills so that we can, I feel like the first one is a cleanup bill. I've tried to work with the various interested parties, and that is purely my goal on this first one, is to pick up a lot of those loose ends that we really needed to do and at least make, we may not solve 100% of all of our issues, but I feel like we could solve 90%. And I think that exceeds even Senator Enzi's 80% rule. So hopefully we'll all go with that. So if you'll pull out the first one, Mental Health Professions Practice Act amendments, I really worked off the language that we had that was provided to us last year in Evanston. And here is what we have. On page 2, we added in the authority to the criminal procedure title for the criminal justice agencies to provide, you'll see the added paragraph on lines 11 through 13, background information. That's from Evanston. And then just turning the page, and then I'll talk about them both. On the top of page 3, in Evanston, there was a staff note about, well, should we have fingerprinting? So I've put in the paragraph on lines 8 through 10 about fingerprinting. And I have to just say, when you consider the population that mental health providers are working with, often one-on-one, not always, but often one-on-one, with people who are in vulnerable situations, to have not required criminal background checks and fingerprinting, I just have to say, I think that was very remiss on our part. So that's what takes up pages 2 and 3. Page 4, and I am going to have a potential amendment in here. We'll come back to that at the end. But page 4, I remember when I was first sitting in on this committee as the future chairman, and there was this whole discussion about how current statute uses the phrase human resource discipline, which doesn't make any sense. I mean, maybe it made sense in 1972 or something, but I think most all of us understand human resources to be the HR folks that look up your labor laws and sign you up in a job when you've got a new employment and such like. It wasn't sensible at all. So I have drafted here, I took actually most of what was in rule, because they had to take human resource and turn it into a rule. So I took their language from rule in this paragraph on lines 4 through 7. I felt they had substance use disorder and substance abuse, which frankly I thought was repetitive. I also added social work and counseling as fields that are addressed later on in the Practice Act. So I have drafted a definition to define what is a human behavioral discipline. And then later on, you'll see in places where it used to say human resource, I have changed it to human behavioral. I personally feel like that's just a cleanup. Then the middle of page 4, we've got the bringing the background check authorization to the board itself. The fingerprinting is part of that. So that's why there's only one paragraph. Okay, then page or line 16 there, requirements for licensure and certification. This is the addition back of the certified mental health worker. And the reason that's in there, and if you can think all the way back to Evanston, the bill, and you'll see this at the end, there were a whole lot of repealers that had to do with certification type things for people who had been working in the state for 2 years before 1997. And those are all repealed because they're no longer timely. But the board and the providers said, well, we still actually want this job to exist, certified mental health worker. So that is here. I didn't touch that. This is all language as we had it in Evanston, according to what they were just trying to add back in. So that's bottom of 4, all of 5, all of 6. You know, you're certainly free to look at it again if you want. But as I say, it was language that we were all comfortable with in Evanston when we were working on this last year. Okay, then bottom of page 6, what I'm attempting to deal with here, and you'll see on line 22, I added mental health work because we were adding that back in. Last spring, so not spring of 2020, but spring of 2019, the board was attempting to update its rules to allow for the ability to have reciprocity for a person with a certification in another state, even if they didn't quite fit all these parameters. It went through the usual process through the AG's office, and the AG's office, and this was what I understood from when I talked to LSO and all a year ago spring, the AG's office said, well, you don't actually have statutory authority to do that kind of reciprocity award. So I said, fine, I'll take what they were attempting to say in rule and put it into statute. I wanted to do it last year, but then we didn't have a bill that carried forward. So what I have on page 7 in the new language, and there's going to be an amendment there as well. For good cause shown, the board shall issue, and frankly, what I submitted to LSO was shall issue certification. They inserted license or presumably thinking that the act covers those both categories, but I want to delete that back out. I think we were actually only attempting to deal with people with certifications. So that's, and I believe that that's what you'll hear from witnesses. To practice to a person seeking reciprocity. So then we've got social worker, addictions practitioner, assistant, or mental health worker. Those are all certified jobs who do not otherwise meet the reciprocity requirements. So in other words, for good cause. Now, I had some discussion with some folks about, well, what's good cause? The board will have to define good cause, and I did look up just now and see we have used the phrase for good cause 181 other times in statute and evidently the boards or, agencies, whoever they are, define that. And so I think, even if we tried to define what's good cause, you'd have to define that further, public interest, whatever. So this has been used 181 times. Then on line 13, we've got, those are the repealers, which was the 1997 and before workers. I will also bring afterwards an amendment. We want to take out the and P because it turns out that the licensed addiction therapists actually had been, and possibly some others, had been grandfathered in with licenses requiring something slightly different. And we do want to enable the board to grandfather in professionals who have existing existing licenses or certifications in the state. We're not trying to suddenly, we had this problem, I don't know how many of you heard, with the speech language people. We thought we were changing and we thought there weren't anybody that had a problem, and then we came up with like 12 of them. So we're just gonna, in an amendment to this bill, I will take out the and P. So that, committee, I hope that you will find this to truly be a cleanup bill, which has been my intention, and I will be glad to answer any questions.
Committee members, do we have any questions? Raise your hand big or I won't be able to see you. Are there any questions for Chairman Wilson? Oh, there's a hand. Chairman Scott. You're muted, Chairman Scott.
this technology will get me sooner or later. Uh, Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page 3, there's the issue of shall those people all have to get fingerprinting and then the criminal history. My memory is when we initially did this bill, that was not included because the system wasn't as well worked out then. And we didn't feel confident that we could get good results. And it was, frankly, wasn't as commonly done as it is now. So the addition may well be appropriate. There's a staff comment there, and that's what, and they're saying about should there be some discretion or should we just go with this? You've got to have it, and would like Co-Chairman Wilson's comments on that staff comment to whether you think we just need to require it or there is in the statute, there is at least one other entity that has some discretion on this fingerprinting. What's your thoughts on that?
Chairman Wilson.
Thank you, Vice Chairman Baldwin. So I see the comment. I would say, in my feeling, I think we need to require it and require it routinely. It says in here that some other boards, and frankly, I kind of question what their requirement is, but if the person has been convicted of a crime or only on the initial. And, you know, if we have jobs, let's just say like occupational therapy, where the person is typically working, you know, in a therapy room, in a facility, and there are, you know, 10 other people around doing things, I'm fine with that. I just think that in the mental health field, you have so often one-on-one situations dealing with people who are really struggling with mental health issues or addictions issues. The potential, I just think the risk is higher. Not that the professionals are riskier, but that the interaction with their patient is so much closer and in more privacy that I just personally, I am not, I mean, the committee can do as it wishes, but I recommend having it be a routine thing, not an optional.
Follow up, Chairman Scott.
Yes, Chairman, the exception is found in 719-201, and it's not really a licensure board. It's subsection E, the Wyoming Military Department, any public fire department, ambulance service, or regional emergency response team may, as a condition of employment, then require this fingerprinting. So it's not a licensure board. It's a bit of a lesser thing where we do grant discretion. I just point that out.
Very good.
I just
Go ahead,
think that in the
Go ahead, Chairman
pyramid of, sorry, Mr. Vice Chairman.
Go ahead, Chairman Wilson.
I just think in the pyramid of potential risk, this category is one of the higher, but as the committee wishes with the bill, of course. Mr. Vice Chair, you have some.
Very good to know. We're having some problems with Zoom. If anybody else having a problem. I believe Senator Schuler has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. Yeah, I just had a question for the bill, I guess on page 4, and I probably should know this, but where it talks about the supervision of a qualified clinical supervisor, when I was reading back through my notes, I guess I just questioned myself, is that determined by the institution or by our state? I mean, I know some states, I think it's determined by how many years that you have, you know, with your clinical experience or your your background, maybe you're a social worker or whatever. So is that defined in statute somewhere, or is it just basically by the state hospital or Life Resource Center or something like that? Thank you.
Chairman Wilson, would you like to answer that?
Mr. Vice Chair, thank you. Yeah, it is defined in statute, and I'll just read it here. A qualified clinical supervisor means a licensed professional counselor, licensed clinical social worker, licensed marriage and family therapist, licensed addiction therapist, all the licensed ones, which frankly are all ones with, and if you go dig further back, any of those licensed ones are people with master's degree or above. Now, I did discover an interesting thing over the weekend while I was working on this, and that is that we don't actually specify that people have to be supervised by qualified clinical supervisors with a licensure in the area of the person that they're supervising. And in discussion with providers, they acknowledge that that had a little bit of potential challenge, but that in our small rural clinics, you may not be able to get one master's degree person for every kind of bachelor's degree person that you have working there. My understanding is, and as I'm sure we'll hear from the board, is that the board is attempting to address those sort of situations by putting in continuing ed requirements that would make people have broader exposure to the underwrite. But anyway, that was a long answer to the that is defined.
Thank you. Any further questions, committee? See no hands raised. I would ask
No, there's
LSO.
one.
Oh, you did see
Representative
one.
Barlow has one.
Okay, his hand was hidden. Go ahead, Representative Barlow.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. So my question is regarding the background check and fingerprinting. Is the intent that it's done annually or whatever the term of the license is or certification? The reason I ask is I don't recall the number of licensures, but if we're adding another group of folks onto the background and fingerprinting on an annual basis, we already have a system that we hear occasionally is already backed up slow and has challenges at the AG's office, at the DCI. So I guess I want to be clear about if that's some of the discretion that maybe Senator Scott, we could look for initial licensure and certification, and then on an as needed basis or something like that. That would be appropriate to lessen the burden, both financial and work burden, on the agency actually performing the task. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Any comments would be appreciated.
Chairman Wilson or Chairman Scott, who wishes to address that?
Aye. Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Chairman Scott.
And I do want to, again, this time publicly say, I appreciate you being willing to chair this segment. I simply don't have the bandwidth to do it effectively. So I appreciate that. My suggestion is that if we're concerned about that, and I think Representative Barlow has brought a valid concern, that after we've heard the public comment, that just adding the words initial after on page 3, line 8, so it'd read applying for initial licensure or certification. That would take care of Representative Barlow's concern and be a precaution against this being repeatedly required.
Mr.
I
Vice
believe
Chair.
that sounds reasonable. Representative Wilson, do you agree?
Mr. Vice Chair, I don't know actually what the licensure periods are for these professions, so we can hear that, I'm sure, during public comment. I partly agree, and I certainly understand the issue. I mean, if it's every year, and we do know that DCI is very backed up, when we find out what the licensure period is, which I neglected to inquire, maybe something along lines of all persons applying for initial licensure and no longer than every 5 years thereafter, or something along those lines, whatever that, if the licensure period is 3 years, we could say so as to not have it be to kind of find a mid-range would be my preference. But again, that we can perhaps wrestle with that a little bit further.
Thank you, Chairman Wilson. I believe that the agencies can probably address that when we get to them here in a minute. Are there any further questions of Representative Wilson? Oh, Representative Sweeney, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. Just I guess a question more than a concern is on the fingerprinting, which I think makes total sense. But I think there are instances where you've got addictions folks that actually have been in and out of trouble. So I would hope that the licensing board, would take that into consideration. They've got the certification or whatever. They've been out of trouble. And so I just, and maybe that's in there and have been addressed. And to one of the points on the fingerprinting that the majority floor leader brought up, I think that when you're looking at national standards on the supervision and clinician point of view, the national standards actually don't require a master's degree for clinical supervision, but that's something that Wyoming has added. So just as a point of reference, which I don't agree with, but that I appreciate the work that the good chairman, Madam Chairman, has done on this, and I don't want to derail anything. So I'll limit my comments to that.
Chairman Wilson, go ahead.
Mr. Vice Chair, thank you. So 2 things to that. One is there are still a number of issues that we might consider in the whole breadth of supervision and mental health, training and that kind of thing. I don't pretend that this has solved all of those. I think that I would love if we could just carry forward with something that cleans up most of them, because some of those other issues on educational, I think, are a little bit broader, and we might just need to work a little more on them. To the point about the fingerprinting, I'm just referring here. So I'm looking in current statute under certified addictions practitioner, and I assume it's on the other as well. I'm not looking right now, but it says the applicant has no felony convictions and no misdemeanor convictions that relate adversely to the practice of addictions therapy or to the ability to practice addictions therapy, although exceptions to this requirement may be granted by the board if consistent with the public interest. So I think that would address Representative Sweeney's question, because you're right. Certainly there are situations when people with lived experience in this area can certainly be useful healthcare providers or work providers in this area, and one would assume that the board would take into consideration various issues of type of conviction, proximity to the current time, and that sort of thing. So, and Mr. Vice Chair, I do also just want to say that if we have a motion to proceed with the bill, as I noted, there are a few amendments. One is to insert a definition for the community mental health worker. Then there was the 2 bits on the last page, just to remind people of those.
Very good. Representative Barlow, you had a question.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. So I'm not sure what the 2 bits on the last page were. Sorry, I've forgotten what they were, but I think D is not inclusive of some of the licensure folks on page 6 of the bill, or 7, excuse me. The new language in D, I think, needs to be modified to include in the to bring in the family practice, the family marriage therapist, and et cetera. So I'll bring an amendment to address that. That may be what Chairman Wilson has already talked about. If not, I'll bring.
Very good. Chairman Wilson.
So, Mr. Vice Chairman, thank you. So to that effect, what I commented on in that paragraph D is that the original attempt of the board last year in the rule change was to only be dealing with the certified professions. And that was what I submitted to LSO, and I didn't catch their insertion of license or. So what I was actually planning to do, and we can hear from the board what their intention was to take out the license or, because I felt that, at least my assumption was that when we've got the license requirements that have supervision ability and various other things, to just open up this very broad reciprocity might be really beyond what we wanted to do. And so the listing of social worker and so on was specific to my original language of certification. The other one on that page was on line 13, the deletion of the and P. That was the other point there, which I'll address later.
Representative Sweeney, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. To that point on reciprocity, I prefer a little broader language, and I believe it's within the scope under statute of substantially similar, you know, for the board to be able to recognize some of these things in other states. But again, I don't want to push too far and not get anything done today. So.
Thank you. Further questions or comments? I'm going to ask LSO. I suspect we have some agency or boards which just weigh in. Is that correct?
That is correct, Mr. Vice Chairman. We will go ahead and let Mr. Greg Searles into the meeting if that is okay.
Very good. I'm watching. If somebody else sees them before I do, let me know. Mr. Searles, can you hear me?
I can, Senator Baldwin. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Senator Baldwin, Representative Wilson, for bringing forth this bill. Just a couple comments that the board has. And I believe
Mr. Searles, can you go ahead and introduce yourself to all that are listening out in Facebook land?
I apologize, Senator Baldwin. My name is Greg Searles. I'm the Executive Director for the Mental Health Professions Licensing Board, as well as 5 other boards here in the state of Wyoming. Just a couple comments and to answer some of the questions that have been brought forth by the committee. Senator Schuler asked about the supervisor. It is defined as Representative Wilson indicated, and then they're individually approved by the board to be able to supervise. And Representative Wilson was correct that being able to supervise for the same type of profession is often difficult in our state. And there was proposals to that have been brought forward, and they were brought with a lot of opposition because of the ruralness of the state. Let's see, and page 7, the reason marriage and family is not in there is because it was originally defined as the certification level only, and there is no certification level offered for the state of Wyoming. They only license at the master's level for a provisional and independent licensed marriage and family therapist. That would be why that was not in there. With reciprocity, as I think most of this committee is aware of, the board did change how it looks at substantially similar. It went into effect in July of last year. And for both licenses and certification, the board only looks at 3 things now. They look to make sure that the person has the degree that's defined in statute by the legislature. They ask for a passing score on the appropriate level of exam for the license or certification that they're seeking. And also we request verification of license or certification in every state held within the last 5 years to determine their eligibility for reciprocity now. Those are the only things being looked at. Individual classes, how many hours of coursework they have, how many hours of supervision they have are no longer looked at by this board to issue licenses by reciprocity. With fingerprinting, the board licenses and renews every 2 years. That's the renewal period. So if you're looking at doing it every so often, it would be in increments of 2 years. The board currently licenses about 2,300 people. So approximately half of that, it's actually probably more like 1,200 in 1 year, 1,100 in another year currently. So that would be the workload that would be placed on DCI for the renewal period, and that happening every so many years. With the Board of Speech Language Pathology and Audiology, we've just got background checks for that board, and currently their processing time for background checks is right around 7 to 10 working days at most. In talking to them when this was first started and this being concerned, Jeff Collin that works for DCI indicated to me that in the last couple of years, they've never gone beyond about 2 weeks to be able to get a DCI background check completed and returned to the board with the full report. And with that, I would stand for question.
Questions, committee? Representative Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. So on reciprocity, I just want to be clear, you're no longer asking for transcripts?
Mr. Sherrill, go ahead.
Co-Chairman Baldwin, Representative Sweeney, we do ask for transcripts just to show that the degree is there and posted to the transcripts. That's the only thing we're looking at on the transcript is the degree, not the individual classes.
Thank you, Senator Schuler.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. Just a question on the fingerprinting. I've heard from a number of folks that it seems like it takes quite a bit of time out of our law enforcement's day when they have to do fingerprints. And we charge actually, I think, more for VIN inspections and spend less time on a VIN. Would you think that considering an increase in that price, would that help a little bit maybe with the workload on our law enforcement people?
Mr. Sherrill, go ahead.
Co-Chairman Baldwin, Senator Schuler, I think that question would be better addressed to the law enforcement agency than the board, as we can't control their licensing fee or know what their current workload is.
I suspect we'll hear from them here soon too. Thank you. Any further questions? I'm seeing no hands in the air. Oh, Chairman Scott.
All right, Mr. Chairman, my question is on page 3. Would there be, it would seem to me that if we were to restrict that to just initial licensure, that would take care of the problem. And from there on, you're dealing with somebody who is licensed that you're aware of. And I think the board would be very likely to hear about any significant criminal activity from that individual once they are licensed. So it would seem to me that just requiring the initial licensure would be adequate. And has the board talked about that issue at all?
Proceed, Mr. Searles, go ahead.
Co-Chairman Baldwin, Co-Chairman Scott, the board has not discussed the issue. Obviously, we would definitely like it for initial licensure so that we know that they've undergone those checks. For those that are already out there and practicing, would it be prudent to have it one time at least to be able to see that there's nothing in their past that we're not aware of? Possibly, but we will do as the committee wishes.
Further questions, committee? Representative Stibar, I believe. You're still muted, Representative Stibar.
If we did it on the first initial, and then every five years do a background check, fingerprints, So if something happens, they don't report it, wouldn't that work just as good as on their initial?
Mr. Searles?
Co-Chairman Baldwin, Representative Stivar. Personally, that may not be a bad idea, but the board has not discussed it, so I can't answer that for the board.
Further questions, committee? Senator Bouchard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to go back to what we were talking about with reciprocity. I mean, if they have a state license in another state, I mean, shouldn't we be moving in a direction to make that a simpler process? And I mean, I'm looking at test scores and transcripts. If they're licensed in another state, there should be some simplicity here. I mean, I see other states like Arizona doing bills to allow all licenses to have reciprocity, and we're still dinking around with some of these issues that we know these professionals work in other states. So why are we still digging that deep when we know especially if they've worked in another state for over a year or over?
Mr. Searles, go ahead.
Senator Baldwin, Senator Bouchard. The board was asked to look at substantially similar and to give a better definition of that, and that's what they did. The concern that was brought forth in some of those discussions, if I recall properly, was the difference in titling between states in using the same acronym for licensing, but they may actually have different scopes of practice than what we have here in Wyoming. And just to ensure that the board was licensing on the same level as to what they were licensed in their state that they're coming from.
Thank you. Further questions? Senator Pappas.
Yes, I have a question. Greg, could you tell me, we had a little snafu on Senate File 87 last year with the background checks. And as I understand, DCI didn't know of that new requirement that we put in the bill, and basically requires that the FBI to approve the language in our statute that before the board can submit fingerprints for background checks, they had to receive this report, and that they won't and that they just won't approve it in advance, and that was taking something like 90 to 120 days. Has that been resolved?
Mr. Searles.
Senator Baldwin, Senator Pappas, what happened was, as you say, yes, DCI was not aware of the statutory language change and needed to submit that to the FBI. As soon as this bill would hit draft and be assigned a number, DCI will be made aware of that so that they can submit it at that time and begin that 90 to 120 day process. What happened with speech was they didn't receive notification until the middle of May to start that 90 to 120 days. As soon as this goes into draft in January or February, that would start the 90 to 120 days, so that should be completed if this bill was signed and went into effect July 1st, so that we should be ahead of that deadline.
Okay, follow on.
Go ahead, Senator Pappas, follow up.
Is this something we could avert down the line if we correct something in our statutes where I guess the 90 and 120 days is probably not in our, we don't have the ability to change that. So maybe it's not. I just was thinking if you knew of a way that we could avert this. I think hopefully as far as the speech language pathologists and audiologists, we've taken care of that issue. But I'm just thinking down the line, is there something that maybe we want to tweak to streamline this whole process?
Reply, Mr. Searles.
Senator Baldwin, Senator Pappas, my understanding from DCI is the FBI has to approve every single instance where we add, or where the legislature would add background authority to someone else.
Thank you.
Very good. Further questions? Chairman Wilson.
Thank you, Vice Chair Baldwin. Just to Senator Papa's question, that's one of the reasons why I've made the bill effective July 1. You know, there are a lot of these, I thought, gee, we've been hacking away at this thing for 4 years. It'd be nice to have it effective immediately. But by making it effective July 1, we've given ourselves and the board that buffer time to actually have all the, I mean, that doesn't make it speedier in the sense of having the things happen, but at least we won't run into the fact that we passed something and they didn't know about it and they ran out of time. This will give them plenty of time anyway.
Very good. Further questions, Mr. Searles? If not, we'll let him abandon the hot chair. And I suspect there's someone else waiting to occupy that chair. Elizabeth, do we have someone else waiting?
Yes, we do indeed, Mr. Vice Chairman. We have Mr. Frank Craig next.
Very good. Admit him, please. Good to see you in committee, Mr. Craig. If you would like to introduce yourself and address the committee, please.
Thank you, Senator Baldwin. Can you hear me?
Hear you perfect. Go ahead.
Great. Members of the committee, my name is Frank Craig. I'm the current president of the Wyoming Association of Professionals. I began working in the addictions field in 1994. I began practicing addictions counseling in 1998. Currently, I'm a state director for the Gateway Foundation, and Gateway contracts the substance use disorder services to the Wyoming Department of Corrections. I am pleased to report to the committee the joint efforts between WANSAC and the WAAP in addressing the draft bills, and we are in agreement as needed changes. Current certified addictions professionals in retrospect to following national standards, referencing NADAC as the national standards for equivalent bachelor's level credential, has been missing a supervised work experience component to round out the full education, training, and work experience requirement that the current requirements are for the state of Wyoming. So the draft bill, this is the LSO 186 bill, that would provide this needed but missing element. And in consideration of supervised work component, the question then becomes how a person would obtain supervised work experience in the field without the authorization or permission of the state to conduct themselves in the scope of practice. I would like to suggest such a way and one that promotes national standards as a career ladder for those entering the field. I just have some reference handouts that provide a little bit of information about what currently the NADAC standards are for both the NCAC2, which is the equivalent for the CAP, and also for NADAC's clinical supervision endorsement. I've also provided some examples of what a provisional certified addictions practitioner might look like. Building on the existing entry-level addiction professional in Wyoming, the CAP assistant or the Kappa would be the springboard to the bachelor level CAP. By requiring a minimum associate's degree in addictions or related human behavioral associate degree, plus an approved accredited certification for addictions such as Casper College offers, then using that entry-level position for individuals who wish to continue their education, working towards the next level, which is the CAP, would then apply the supervised work experience and a means of obtaining that experience. By taking the language already provided in the Practice Act under Chapter 3338-106, it would be very easy to create a provisional certification, if you will, and provide such a mechanism for the supervised work experience component. Most states outline such a network of this experience component, which typically is based on educational levels on a sliding scale. NADAC's current requirements for the equivalent CAP, which is the NCAC2, does have a required 6,000 hour supervised work experience. Although I would point out that this also can consider any additional formal education to count towards those hours, and will still require successful passing of a national examination set by the board. NADAC is also in discussion right now in lowering those hours for the NCAC2, as well as creating their own new associate level credential. Additional consideration may also require looking at how clinical supervision is able to be offered in Wyoming by comparison to other states and national standards. I believe some of the questions earlier were speaking to this. There is a national endorsement for clinical supervisor for addictions professionals, which requires additional coursework as well as successfully passing an examination for supervision. Currently in Wyoming, as you heard, the designated qualified clinical supervisor must have 2 years post-license before they're able to provide supervision, and not necessarily within the scope of their practice. But it does not speak to any additional requirements, such as the specificity of addictions knowledge or having any requirements for examination for clinical supervisor to show competency in the ability to do that kind of supervision. If you will, entertain perhaps, and maybe for future discussion, the notion of an addictions professional clinical supervisor at the bachelor's level. And most states allow that, as well as a national standard. These are suggestions that are offered for any additional amendments as the committee may see necessary, and are presented in the spirit of national standards for addictions professionals, and the hope that Wyoming may better align the addictions professions here with those current standards and best practices. In my own personal career development, I was able to begin addictions counseling with my bachelor's degree in sociology, and after 4,000 hours of supervised work experience and passing a national ICNRC examination allowed me to obtain my independent licensed chemical dependency counselor in Texas. After having obtained that license at the bachelor's level, I was able to provide clinical supervision to other interns, or in this case, provisional certified counselor. In respect to the required background checks for certification and licensing, that's pretty standard across the board. I would be in support of that. In additional measures to strengthen the true reciprocity, we would support those language changes. In retrospect to my experiences where reciprocity is concerned, the scrutiny over transcripts and validating a test score has been an obstacle. Recently had hired a lady from Colorado with an LPC who has been practicing for 10 years, and she didn't know would she land in Wyoming or Nebraska, so she applied at the same time to both states. Nebraska, she had her LPC in 3 days. Wyoming, it took 6 weeks because she was required to present her transcripts and then verify her test score from her original LPC. The scope of practice is the same in all 3 states. Outside of those comments, what you see in this bill that was discussed and then the CAP bill, and I think WAMSAC, Ms. Somerville may have some additional things to present on that. But the WAAP is in full support of both of these bills. And with that, I stand for any questions.
Questions, committee? Questions for Mr. Craig? Don't all speak at once, or don't all hold your hands up at once. Thank you, Mr. Craig. Oh, Representative Sweeney, I knew we could count on him. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. So, Mr. Craig, on the reciprocity points that you made right there at the end, do you already feel that that's within the board's purview, or can they simply update things to react quicker through rule, in your opinion?
Mr. Craig, go ahead.
Senator Baldwin, co-chair, Representative Sweeney. I believe that in the current statute that the board would have the ability to accept a license in good standing as it's defined for what it is. I can't speak in terms of other specific professionals, but there was a question earlier regarding the scope of practice and how that could differ by state to state. But I can tell you that for addictions professionals, the scope is the same across the board. By and large, that would mean if you meet the national standards for the baseline certifications and you pass the examinations, that's sufficient.
Thank you, Mr. Craig. Further questions or follow-up? Senator Bouchard.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. I would like to know, just maybe to entertain this committee for future use, if we could ask Mr. Craig to redact any pertinent information and show us those so we can have them as an exhibit, that this is actually happening, that it's easier to get something done in another state than here in Wyoming. Because I think, and that, by the way, that happens on a lot of different type of permits and licenses where we see it is easier to get things done in other states. And that's because there has to be some kind of progressive change as things change from state to state. Things get better in other states. We shouldn't always be on the last edge. We should be on the cutting edge. So would that be out of the purview of the committee to have those documents so we can see that for ourselves? Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Bouchard. I believe that that's something that we can ask Mr. Craig to bring forth, assuming that this bill passes forward, that he could bring to us in a committee meeting when we get into session. If the co-chairs would agree to that, you can shake your head if you say yes. Very good. Mr. Craig, would that be agreeable to you? Go ahead.
Senator Baldwin, co-chair, and members of the committee, I would be glad to provide that information. Understandably, in my role as a contractor to the Department of Correction, I would have to have their authorization to cooperate with in respect to that, but I don't foresee that as being a problem.
Thank you very much. We appreciate the effort. And if there's a problem, you should let the chairman know, not the substitute chair. Let the chairman know, and then we'll give you a hand and get that worked out. Further questions for Mr. Craig? Seeing no hands, I would ask Elizabeth again, do we have someone else waiting? Thank you very much, Mr. Craig.
Thank you.
We do, Mr. Vice Chairman. We have Andy Somerville next.
Very good. Go ahead and admit her. I see your name, Miss Somerville. Are you ready to speak? Oh, I lost your name. There you are. Go ahead, Miss Somerville. Welcome back.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. Andy Somerville representing WAMSAC. I apologize. It looks like I've got a little bit of a video lag going on here. Can you guys still hear me okay?
You sound great and you have an excellent background, by the way.
Thank you. It's a little less smoky in the background than it actually is here down in Laramie right now. So specific to the mental health licensing bill, we just had a few comments. First, I'll start out with the background checks and the fingerprinting. WAMSAC wholeheartedly supports that. We'd like to make sure that that's kept in this version of the bill and hopefully passed through the session. Along the conversation about how often we should do it after the initial, I think we should really look at least periodic rechecks, and maybe every 5 years is the balance between workload and trying to make sure that we are catching anybody that may have gotten into something and making sure that information is getting to the licensing board. I cannot speak from any knowledge on how those communication channels work right now. If the board receives prompt knowledge on what's going on, but I think it would be certainly in the public's best interest to keep those at a periodic level after the first background investigation was done. Second was just wanted to make a comment on the repeals section. So on the repealers on the last page, as Madam Co-Chair Wilson had indicated, we'd like the committee to consider putting the letter P back in. We may still have a few people that were grandfathered under those old rules, and we would hate for them to lose their ability to renew that license. We may be in a position where we're going to age out of those licenses over the next 10 or 20 years or so, but for right now, we'd like to keep that back in. Specific to the adding the mental health worker scope of practice as submitted mental health licensing board, we support that if that's consistent with how the other statutes are written in defining scope of practice. We think that's a good piece to add. And then the last comment I wanted to make was on the last page 7, under the good cause exception. We think that this could be an important tool in the toolbox to try to catch those who are certified out of state that may not specifically meet any of the other requirements. We are comfortable right now with certification to practice in the state being in there. I don't have any comments back from my members on adding licensure into that good cause exception. So I just ask for some additional time on that conversation before we get to session if this bill progresses. Other than that, we support the bill. We think it's a good first step to fixing a lot of the issues that were out there. And I would stand for any questions.
Questions, committee? Representative Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. Thank you, Andy, for your hard work on this. Question on the 5-year concept that Representative Stivar brought up and you mentioned. So if still 5 years from now, stuff's backlogged, the board would, using common sense, be able to, with a simple stroke, at least let somebody continue to practice, provisionally if the background check didn't come back in a timely manner, if it wasn't too far ahead of time. Would you agree with that observation?
Ms. Summer.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. Representative Sweeney. I think that's an important practical consideration to consider. We certainly don't want people waiting on licenses or not being able to practice while they're getting a background investigation re-upped. So if there's a way to provide the board with some of that flexibility, I would defer to LSO because I don't know what that wording would be, but I think that's worth considering.
Further questions from Ms. Somerville? Everybody's hands are broken. I'm not seeing any come up. Thank you very much, Ms. Somerville. Elizabeth, is there someone else dying to see us?
Yes, sir. There is one more individual for this bill, Lindsay Semino. I will let her in.
Okay, admit her. If you couldn't say her name, I don't know how you want me to say the name. And there she is, Miss Semino. You tell me how to say your name, Lindsay, and I'll say it right. You're muted, Lindsay. Go ahead.
Forgive me, Vice Chair. I was so excited to mute my YouTube feed. I forgot to unmute here. Vice Chair, I am Lindsay Semino with the Wyoming Counseling Association. We are in support of this mental health bill when it comes to those background checks. As a few comments, and of course, I will defer to the committee and to LSO for this. The timeline for 5 years seems to be a number that is liked. And And for us as practitioners, we renew every 2 years. It's triggered by our birthday. Renewing possibly every other renewal gives you that 4-year mark. If this is something that the committee wants to discuss, this is something that the Wyoming Counseling Association is open to. Our big thing is that we're really hoping to have that continued background checks to be able to offer the public that safety net to know that their providers are being monitored. We do not believe that this bill will limit anyone with lived experience, but it will give knowledge to the board in order to have those conversations with those who have lived experience and then are able to use that within the field. We know that that is very effective as well. I don't know, because we're about 45 seconds delayed from YouTube, if my colleague Andy Somerville was able to change shall to may on page 7, line 5. I'm looking for any confirmation. Oh, thank you, Representative Sweeney. What that would do, as of right now, it says that the board shall issue a license or issue that certification. We'd like to change that to may. We do, it gives the board that flexibility in order to respond to those applications as they see fit. Otherwise, we're excited about this bill and excited to see it move forward, and I stand for any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Semino. Are there any questions from the committee? I'm seeing no questions again. Thank you very much, Ms. Semino. We appreciate you. Hang tight. If we need anything else, we'll call you back. Elizabeth, do we have any other public comment?
No, sir, we don't have any other public comment on our list for this bill.
With that, we'll close public comment. We'll bring it back to committee. Would someone like to move the bill? It looks like Senator Scott, Chairman Scott.
Yeah.
Second
Chairman,
by Representative. Go ahead.
I do move the bill for introduction. I don't think we're going to need to hold this one over for the next meeting, and I think we move to introduce it at this point. So I move.
Moved. Second, is that Representative Stivar seconding this? Got it. We have a first, we have an admission and a second. Discussion committee. Chairman Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. I do have some amendments that I would just like to present, and we can do them one by one if we like. Certainly there may be other amendments, but just to kind of get this off of my list. First of all, I did email out to you, or I believe you received it from LSO. We had a suggested amendment on page 4. I would put it at line 3. After we develop this, in reviewing the current definitions for the various professions, they came back, and I sent you his entire email. Most of the professions really identify some scope of practice, and the certified mental health worker did not has just a really minimal description. And so you can see in your email, and this is a little bit long, that's why I've emailed it to you. So I would move on page 4, line 3 to insert, and I have lost track of what the actual, it would be under section A sub 12. You can see the human behavioral discipline is 17. So this one would be 12, so it'd come before. And it would say this: certified mental health worker means a person certified under this act to perform the application of human services or psychological theory and methods to the assessment, treatment, or prevention of psychosocial dysfunction, disability, or impairment, including emotional or mental disorders, under the supervision of a designated qualified clinical supervisor licensed in the state of Wyoming. The practice of a certified mental health worker does not include assigning a diagnosis or acting as a primary treatment provider. That is what the board has suggested as a replacement. The current, just so you know, the current definition is really minimal, and what it says is that it means a person certified under this act to perform mental health procedures under the supervision of a qualified clinical supervisor licensed in the state of Wyoming. So that's my first amendment.
Let's go ahead and work on that one, Ms. Chair. Do we have a second to that amendment? Senator Scott. Any discussion on that amendment? I am seeing no discussion hands on that amendment. Oh, Senator Scott, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I would also ask that LSO be given some authority to fit the draft in amendment in properly into the draft and adjust some language if necessary. You may have to get rid of the definition that's there now or add this to that. Don't want to change the substance, but to be able to fit it in the draft.
I believe that's perfectly permissible. Thank you, Senator Scott. Any further discussion? If that's agreeable with LSO. All I see is just your heads. You can't shake them because you're not live, but I believe that's okay. Any further discussion? If there's no further discussion, let's take a vote on this. All those in favor of Chairman Wilson's, please raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 11. I can't tell if Senator or Representative Barlow has his hand up or not. But it passes regardless. It's quite a few. Thank you very much. And looking at my chat room here real quick before we move on, I noticed that Elizabeth mentioned that Mr. Searles wanted to respond to Mr. Sweeney's question. If it's okay with the committee, if we can get a quick answer from Mr. Searles, let's let him back in, let him go ahead and answer that question he desired to. Go ahead, Mr. Searles.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Representative Sweeney, in response to your question about if the backlog would occur with DCI, as long as an applicant has submitted their full application, their fee, and their fingerprints to start the background process, their application and their ability to practice remains open until the board would make a final determination based upon any results that they might receive from that background check. So they would be able to continue to practice even if there is a backlog.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Searles. And now we'll take it back to Co-Chair Wilson, I believe, for another amendment.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. The second amendment is on page 7, line 6. My original language was to just say, for good cause shown, the board shall issue a certification to practice, and then listed the certifications. So I would move to delete the words license or, and I can flesh that out a little bit if there's a second.
John, go ahead, Mr. Brody.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. Just for the benefit of the committee, I think a conforming amendment would also need to be made to line 10. It refers to subsections A and B, and subsection A is in reference to the licensure reciprocity provision within that statute. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Brody. Is that agreeable with you, Chairman, Co-Chairman Wilson? She's shaking her head yes. Or is there any discussion on this amendment? Go ahead, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, Madam Chairman, why do you feel the need that license needs to come out and only leave certification?
So, Mr. Vice Chair.
Go ahead.
In the sense of coming out, it's because originally it wasn't in there, first of all. And so I'm hypothesizing, and Mr. Searles may want to speak more to this, because this was really, I started off with the board's attempt to open up their rules a bit last year. My thinking would just be that the certification fields are perhaps, because of being bachelor level or even, less education, that there is perhaps a little bit more variability and there might be more need to give flexibility in the reciprocity, whereas the licensure being a master's level and potential of supervision, I'm a little concerned that if we just say, well, board, the legislature has just given you all these rules and statutes about how to protect the consumers and whatnot in this, but if you feel differently, do whatever you want for anybody. I mean, I felt like maybe that was a step too far as granting broad authority to a board beyond what we had specified. But I do feel that maybe Mr. Searles might have a better answer.
Mr. Searles, if you're still loitering out there, would you like to comment on this?
Mr. Co-Chair, Representative Wilson, I honestly am not sure that the board proposed this language. So I don't know as I do have any comment to this as to why it was just for certification and not licensure.
So, Mr. Vice Chair.
Go ahead.
So this is what I was working off from last year. And of course, you know how notes somewhat permutate, mutate through years. But my understanding was the language that the AG's office struck from their rules last year was this: applicants that do not meet the reciprocity requirements may petition the board for an exemption. The board may grant a certification to such applicant if good cause is shown. So my assumption in reading that was that they were trying to grant a certification. You can only grant certifications to people who get certified. You can't grant a certification to licensed people. So I felt that it would maybe make people on the floor feel better when they read this if they knew what the certifications were. So that's why I added in the list of the certification. But last year's rule request was to may grant certification. So this is my fleshing out of that.
Chairman Wilson, further comment, Mr. Searles?
Co-Chair Baldwin, Representative Wilson, and I do recall the language that you're referring to that was struck by LSO saying that the board didn't have the authority to do that. And honestly, I don't remember why it was only certification and not licensure. I apologize.
No need to apologize. Thank you. Senator Representative Wilson.
Mr. Vice Chair, thank you. So as to this, my request, just as a person putting this together, if you will delete the license, or just because this is the language as is has been floating around providers and so on for about a month, and they've been able to comment or give input to me about certification. If we want to extend this to all the licensure things, maybe we could add that in session when we have a chance to hear more from the board and from the licensed professions about how that would play out. That would make me feel a little bit more comfortable, but there's plenty of you to vote, so.
Thank you, Chairman Wilson. I guess I would concur with that, is that this will give everybody a chance to chew on it, look at it, and during session, we will have that opportunity to, if the rest of the committee agrees with that. Senator Pappas, go ahead.
Yes, I was also in that amendment. We heard testimony changing the word shall to may. Was that part of it?
Mr. Vice Chair.
Chairman Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair, Senator Pappas. So that is not my amendment. That mine is to stay with the shall. If we want to bring up the may issue, I think we should consider that separately.
Senator Pappas, go ahead.
Could we, well, I don't, seems like a pretty simple amendment to this amendment. If we could just get it resolved, could I ask that we ask Mr. Searles what he thinks about that and how it would affect him and his board?
We can ask him, Mr. Searles. You didn't get very far away. Go ahead.
I didn't plan on going very far, Mr. Co-Chairman, Senator Pappas. I understand the use of good cause in many areas, but I think the shall becomes, if the person believes it's good cause, but the board does not believe it good cause, do we still have to issue the license? Where if it's a may, then that leaves the board some authority to be able to determine and have this say as to whether it is or is not good cause.
Chairman Scott, go ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, on that issue, and I think it is a separate issue and should be a separate amendment if somebody wants to bring it. As a practical matter, it doesn't make a tremendous amount of difference, because if the board thinks it shouldn't be done, they'll find that there isn't good cause. Having a shall in there, if somebody wants to contest them in court, gives them a little better chance, because if it says may, the court's just going to say the board clearly has discretion, no matter how much good cause you show. If we leave it the way it is, then there is that restraint on what the board does, that if there really is a good cause there and it would carry in court, they'd better recognize it. So I think it's safer the way it is written, although I think in practice, the distinction would be very infrequently important, because this is an entry level thing. If they consistently refuse to find good cause when it existed, you might get a potential employer would finance a suit against them. So there is some constraint imposed by the shall that they really have to take the good cause seriously. But beyond that, I think we're much better off with the language as it's written.
Committee, if you're in agreement, let's go ahead and move on with the amendment on the floor. And if someone wishes to raise that, then we can go ahead. Senator Bashar, do you have a comment? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. I concur, and that we should leave this language alone. I mean, I'm looking at it as far as license or certification, and I really think it determines on how they come from another state. I mean, and I think that the board has room to make that determination on its own. I don't think we need to remove the or in this clause. I think it's fine the way it is.
Mr. Co-Chair.
Go ahead.
Representative Allen. You've got me blocked on the video. Can you put me back on the video? Start my video.
I don't believe I can, but somebody here on this group may have the power to do that. Katie or Elizabeth, has somebody got that ability? Or perhaps one of the other chairman? Oh, there he is. You're back, Representative.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, committee, I would move we go ahead and go ahead and deal with the amendments that's on the floor if you're all in agreement with that. Are there any additional comments or discussion on the amendment on the floor? Representative Sweeney.
Thank you. So we're voting, the may portion is gone. The may and shall, the shall's going to remain. So what we're voting on is taking out licensure or license or. Is that correct?
That is the motion, Representative. Correct, Chairman Wilson?
That's correct. And
That's
the
correct.
conforming amendment on line 10.
And I would speak against that. I'm more comfortable if we leave license in, because if we only go certifications, I've got a feeling that'll not take into consideration license like a bachelor's degree in another state, only certifications. So I would urge a no vote.
Further discussion? Seeing no further discussion, we're voting on the amendment to remove licenses or with the concurrent amendment earlier in the other paragraph. All those in favor of this amendment, please raise your big hand in front of your face. 1, 2, 3. I see 3. All those opposed? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That amendment did not pass. Back to Chairman Wilson. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. I do have one further. I would like to point out now that those of you who want licensure to remain now need to amend the paragraph to bring in all the licensures, or else delete all of the specifications, because the paragraph is no longer internally consistent. So the final amendment is on page 7, line 13, to delete the word "and P," because we want to keep paragraph P in the statute to allow for the grandfathering of current licensees.
Okay.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Is there a discussion on this amendment? I see no discussion. Let's vote on this amendment. All those in favor of this amendment, page 7, line 13, omitting "and P," please raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and I can see it passes. Are there further amendments? Representative Stivar.
Yeah, page 7, line 5, change "shall" to "may."
Thank you. Discussion on this amendment, changing the "shall" in line 5 to from "shall" to "may." Any discussion? Any questions? Representative Sweeney.
Was that seconded?
It was not. Thank you, Representative. Is there a second to that? Representative Yen seconds that. Further discussion? Representative Sweeney.
I would urge a no vote. I think "shall" is what's needed. And I think at this point, let's leave it as "shall." And then as we move this forward, as Madam Chairman indicated, there's more flushing out that needs to come on a list of all the licenses. So to be included, which can be worked. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Sweeney. Senator Bouchard.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. I also agree with Representative Sweeney. I think that Chairman Scott's summarization of a good reason to leave it the way it is stands, and I would urge people to vote against a change.
Thank you, Senator. Further discussion. Representative Yen.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. The reason I seconded it was because while I do agree with Co-Chairman Scott's lay of the land, the way I would frame it would be a little different. I would say, do you want the court system to decide what is considered for good cause, or do you want the board to decide? Because if you keep it as "shall," it still holds room for a lawsuit where if someone disagrees with what for good cause is, they can take it to the court system and then a judge decides. Otherwise, if you leave it to the "may," it kind of closes the door on the idea of a lawsuit, and whatever the board basically rules essentially stands, because even if you argue that it is for a good cause, the board isn't necessarily obligated to push the licensure. So I leave it up to the committee to decide who they really want to be the final arbiter on that decision. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman.
Senator Bouchard, you had a comment. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to address that about the courts. It's a different issue, but it's very similar. And it has to do with how they used to do firearm permits. It used to be across the nation that it was a "may" issue. That whole country was a "may" issue at one time. I think Florida became one of the first ones to do a "shall" issue. Wyoming, somewhere in that whole mix, became a "shall" issue state. And what it really does is that when everybody moved to "shall" issue on firearm permits, what happened is it actually alludes to what Chairman Scott said, is that it forces everyone to say, hey, unless there's a real problem here, we are going to issue a permit. So that's kind of applicable here in this case too. What we're doing is saying they shall do it. And of course, if there's some reason where they can articulate, they're going to do it, and it probably will hold muster, so that way nobody's taking it to court. And like I said, that is in play already on these other shall issue on permits. For instance, you don't see the court system being drug into it. They darn sure make sure there's a reason not to issue a permit. Same thing in this, whether it's a license or certification. It makes everybody stay honest on both sides of the fence. So I would urge that we keep the language the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Bouchard. Any further comments or discussion on this amendment? The amendment being page 7, line 5, to delete shall and insert may. With no further discussion, all those in favor of this amendment, please raise your hands. 1, 2, going, gone. All those opposed, please raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, more than 2. That amendment fails. Are there further amendments? Further amendments on the bill, or are you ready to call the question? I sense a desire to call the question on this bill. John, would you like to go ahead and call the roll, please?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. This vote is on whether the committee will sponsor 21 LSO 180 as amended. Vice Chairman Baldwin.
Aye.
Senator Bouchard.
Aye.
Senator Pappas.
Aye.
Senator Schuler.
Aye.
Representative Barlow.
Excused.
Representative Kling.
Excused.
Representative Dayton Selman.
Aye.
Representative Hallinan.
Aye.
Representative Roscoe.
Aye.
Representative Stibar.
Aye.
Representative Sweeney.
Aye.
Representative Yin.
Aye.
Co-Chairman Scott.
Aye.
Co-Chairman Wilson.
Aye.
Motion has been adopted.
Very
Thank
good.
you very much. Taking the prerogative of the vice chair, I'm going to suggest a 10-minute break, and we'll come back. We're way behind, so only a 10-minute, none of those 20-minute breaks. 10 minutes. We will be back at 3:45. It would appear as though we have a group back. Let's go ahead. Chairman Wilson, you're back. We'll go ahead on to the next bill for Senator Wilson to present to us. Go ahead, Chairman Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. I appreciate you chairing. It would have been kind of difficult to answer questions and call on people all at the same time. So the next bill is 21 LSO 0186, Certified Addictions Practitioner Certification Amendments. Now I separated this out. The idea was suggested to me just because we thought that the previous bill was fairly non-controversial, although we still managed to talk about it for a long time. And we wanted, at the very least, for all that material to pass. So this has to do with the Certified Addictions Practitioners. Again, I worked off of the Evanston language from last year. So what we have on page 2, paragraph C is existing language. So that's only there to show because on line 10, it comes in to the following colon. All right. So what I have done here is on line 13, I changed to human behavioral discipline from that human resource. Now we provided the definition in the bill that we just passed. My assumption is that if we pass both these bills out of committee, that we will run that first one first, and then so the definition will be changed and it will just pick up here. If for some strange reason that first bill doesn't make it through the process and this one does, then we'll have to amend in the definition, but I didn't want to bother putting it in twice. So that's all that is on line 13. Lines 16 and 17, those were amendments that we made in Evanston about bringing in the national standards for accreditation, having to do, now remember, this is the baccalaureate degree level, not the assistant, but the practitioner, or has received a baccalaureate level equivalency in addiction therapy. Now, I will be plain here on line 19 in Evanston, and this was a part, I think this was a part that really prevented the bill from going forward. And I would really like at least what we can to go forward. There may still be things that people want to tidy up or do differently, but if we can just at least get some of these through, you know, this is just probably going to be a gradual process. So in Evanston, where we have line 19, or has received a baccalaureate level equivalency in addiction therapy. This is where in the Evanston bill, it said, or, and it had in, and frankly, I don't even have it in front of me, we had put where you could have worked instead of the education, okay? I felt like that was very challenging to a lot of folks. I wasn't too fond of it myself, and so I have just removed that because in the hopes that we can at least get the basics through. Okay, then in performing its duties under this paragraph, the board shall use the professional training and so on at national profession. Those are again from Evanston. Now I will say that I have had emailed into me a possible amendment to say consult on line 20. The board shall consult rather than the board shall use. That'll be a later amendment, but right now it's the board shall use. Turning the page, or the standards of an appropriate federal agency. And again, that was language from last year. Okay, this next paragraph, again, this was mostly from the Evanston language. On line 6, we had, Evanston said human resource. I've changed again to human behavioral just to clean that up. And then I'm going to, so thinking back to our definition from last time, the human behavioral discipline, let's suppose a person has a sociology degree or a social work degree, okay? A bachelor's degree in sociology, or I'm sorry, social work, not in addiction therapy, picking up on line 7, may be granted certification under this subsection after providing satisfactory proof of the completion of 2,000 hours of supervised work experience in the field of addiction therapy. Now in Evanston, we had satisfactory proof of completion of 2,000 hours of supervised work experience. That's all it said. In Evanston, we voted for an amendment that I made to say in the field of addiction therapy, so that you couldn't just say, well, I worked for 2,000 hours selling tires at Sam the Tire Man. That's work experience. I mean, just to be clear, I'm not a lawyer, but I've spent way too much time hanging around them lately. And I will have some further amendments based on input from people over the weekend, inserting in about an exam and specifying that the work experience will be as a Kappa or equivalent, but those will be amendments. So you can see as it is, it's very brief. The only real changes from Evanston are 1, to clear up the human resource, the human behavioral, and 2, to take out the work equivalency for education, which I felt like was a real stumbling block. And this way we can at least clean it up. And those people who are interested in that component can deal with that later. So that's the bill. Such a short
Chairman
bill.
Wilson. Comments on the bill, committee? Chairman Scott.
Mr. Chairman, let me say first, I'm very supportive of this bill. It isn't everything we wanted, but I think we've got we've got a chance of getting it passed. On page 3, line 10, I was thinking about this last night and eventually said, what would happen if we said, that rather than just supervised work experience, if we said supervised relevant professional work experience? So there would be some ability of the board to say, look, your experience was as a janitor at one of these places. That's not relevant professional experience. It's just a suggestion. I'd like to hear what Co-Chairman Wilson says about it.
Co-Chairman Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. Thank you, Senator. And along those lines, the amendment that was suggested to me, and I didn't send them out because they're short, but if the bill, if we have a motion on the bill and go through, what was suggested to me is, and I'll just pick up at the beginning of line 10, there's 2 separate statements, but 2,000 hours of supervised work experience as a certified addictions practitioner, assistant, or equivalent in the field of addiction therapy, and having passed an examination as required under 33 blah, blah, blah. Those are 2 separate things. We can either consider them together or separately, but it was suggested to me by the practitioners that to not just say supervised work experience in the field of addiction therapy, which yes, that is a little vague, but to say specifically as a Kappa or equivalent, that somewhat fleshes out the idea that Mr. Craig had as far as the career ladder. So that is an amendment that will be coming later.
Thank you, Chairman Wilson. Representative Stivar, you had a comment.
Co-Chairman, Chairman Wilson, the 2,000 hours, NADAC requires 6,000 hours. I mean, why are we dropping the standard? You know, if NADAC's saying 6,000, we're saying 2,000, what's the difference?
Chairman Wilson.
Mr. Vice Chair, thank you. Yes. So to my best of my recollection, the 2,000 hours was in the Evanston bill, and I just carried on from there, not creating something new. I do understand that the national standard is a lot more. However, frankly, and I don't like the equivalency thing that I took out in the previous paragraph, but realistically, I think if a person has a bachelor's degree in some human behavioral discipline and has worked for a year in addictions therapy, I'm happy with that. And so if we're a little bit more liberal than national standards, I'm okay with that. If people want to change the number of hours, you know, after other testimony, that's fine too.
Thank you, Chairman Wilson. Further discussion? Senator Schuler.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. If I recall, and again, it's been a while since our Evanston meeting, but it seems like, you know, this kind of came about as a result of having some shortages in this area. And the fact that we have a need here that we can't seem to fill. And not that I think that 2,000 hours is the end all be all, but I do like Senator Scott's and also Representative Wilson's the ability to maybe amend that, because I think that putting in the relevant professional work experience, that'll make a big difference. I think there was some testimony, if I recall, talking about the fact that we have some folks that some of their life experiences might be, almost as good as those who have a degree and many, many hours beyond. So I think what we have here is a pretty good start in the right direction. I also believe that, as Senator Scott said, it's not the end all be all, but I think we've got a pretty good bill going forward. And I do appreciate the work that Representative Wilson has done on this, because I think there is a need, and we're a little bit shorthanded in the state. And I think as time goes on with budget cuts and everything else we're looking at, we're going to have even more of a need. So I think we're headed in the right direction with this bill. Thank you. Thank you, Vice Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Schuler. Further discussions or questions from the committee? Further questions or discussion? If there's no further discussion or questions, let's move to the agencies or public discussion. Elizabeth, who do we have waiting for us?
Mr. Vice Chairman, Greg Cereals, who is already a part of the meeting, was first on our list.
Very good. Thank you very much. I'm watching for a picture. There he is. Mr. Searles, go ahead. Welcome back.
Thank you, Senator Baldwin. Once again, Greg Searles, Executive Director for the Mental Health Professions Licensing Board Office. The only comments that the board had regarding this bill were on page 2, line 17, actually starting on 16, which meets national standards for accreditation in the field of addiction therapy as established by the board. The board's not sure that it has the ability to establish national standards for accreditation, and that we may need to look at that language and clarify what's trying to be said there, because the board does not have accreditation authority in education. The other comment we had was also the exam, which I understand is going to be addressed, but also going back to the comment that was made with the changes on line 22, page 2 through the start of page 3. It's directing the board to use the professional training and experience standard of the appropriate national professional associations or the standards of an appropriate federal agency, but yet, and then in paragraph 7, it's establishing something that's not the national standard. So it seems to be a little conflictual in nature in the way that it's written, and would need to be addressed in that manner as well. And I would stand for question.
Mr. Searles, question from Mr. Searles. Senator Scott, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, question from Mr. Searles. I see what the point on page 2, line 18 is established by the board. What we're trying to do is give the board authority to say if there's conflicting national standards, pick the one that's relevant. If we said if we replace the word established by the word accepted, so it'd be accepted by the board, would that solve their problem and get the job done?
Mr. Searles, go ahead.
Co-Chairman Baldwin, Senator Scott, I believe if you're referring to changing the word established on 19 to accepted, am I understanding that correctly?
Chairman Scott?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, on line 18, yes.
Go ahead, Mr. Searles.
Then yes, I believe that that could possibly solve the issue.
Further questions or discussion for Mr. Searles? Seeing no hands. Thank you, Mr. Searles. Again, as always, don't run too far. Go grab a candy bar, but hang around. Elizabeth, who would we have up next?
Mr. Vice Chairman, we have Katie Jackson next.
Very good. Please admit her. Miss Jackson, please go ahead and unmute yourself and let us hear what you have to say. Introduce yourself, please. You're still muted. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. Good afternoon, co-chairman or Madam Chairman, co-chairman, and members of the committee. You guys hear me?
You sound good and clear. You might want to scoot your screen down a little bit as we can only see just the very top of your forehead.
Is that
a little
better?
bit more. That's good. That's perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. My name is Katie Jackson, and I'm currently employed with the Gateway Foundation in the Intensive Residential Treatment Unit at the Wyoming Correctional Institution. I'm here today to share with you on my experience in trying to obtain the Certified Addiction Practitioner certification in the state of Wyoming. I've been employed with the Gateway Foundation for approximately a year and a half now. Since the beginning of my employment with Gateway, I've been vigorously trying to obtain my CAP certification. The Wyoming board says that I do not meet all of the requirements, the educational requirements. However, according to the national standards, I meet the requirements for not only a level 1, but a level 2 national certified addictions counselor, because I have a bachelor's in psychology and I've taken undergraduate classes and graduate level courses focusing in addiction studies. The national standards for the equivalent credentials say you are only required to have 450 hours of specific drug and alcohol education, where our board mandates college courses, and the Wyoming statute outlining requirements for education for CAP require the board to use National Association standards for education, training, and experience. I have paid fees to the board 2 different times in my efforts. Yes, 2 different times in the last year and a half. And I still do not have my certification. I have taken courses with Casper College to help satisfy educational requirements. Sorry. It should be noted that Casper College has accepted my coursework from Western Nebraska Community College and Shattered State College, as it has met my requirements to count towards their addiction studies program. However, not all of this coursework is being recognized by the board. Currently, I'm enrolled in a master's program, taking classes, along with being enrolled in addiction studies classes at Casper State College, to try to fulfill more educational requirements. And this is continuously spending more money to help fulfill these educational requirements. And all I'm trying to do is just to get my application approved so I can take the CAP exam to further and get certified to practice in the state of Wyoming. I was born and raised here in Wyoming. And I want to raise my family in Wyoming. I moved away for 18 years and I obtained my degree in psychology in Nebraska, but I wanted to move back because this is where I want to raise my 3 kids. Because this is where my home is. And I want to give my kids a piece of my home. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. And with that, I will stand for any questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jackson, for 2 things, for all that you do and for taking the time to come visit with the committee. Does the committee have any questions for Ms. Jackson? Senator Scott.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, as I read the bill, and I want to see if she reads it the same way, if we were to pass this bill, this should solve her problem, should it not? And I'm just trying to check that this would solve the problem, and the education she's already got would meet the qualifications.
Ms. Jackson, go ahead.
Co-chairman, yes, this should, Co-chairman Scott, yes, this should solve the problems, yes. As I would have more than enough education.
Thank you, Ms. Jackson. Any further questions for Ms. Jackson? Representative Sweeney, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. Ms. Jackson, again, thank you for coming. And we hear stories like this, and I appreciate your testimony very much. I don't think it necessarily needs to take this bill to just get the board's attention on some of this stuff. And to Chairman Scott's point, the problem I see now with this is going to go on, if we're able to get this through, she's going to continue to experience these problems until July of 21, when this would go into effect, and continue to spend more money on coursework that really she's got a bachelor's in psychology, as I understand her testimony, and I'm not getting it. Why there's such problems and continues to be such problems, but I do appreciate your testimony, and with that, I'll leave it. But I don't know if the bill's going to take care of the whole situation as it goes on, but I hope it does.
Thank you, Representative Sweeney. Would you like to reply to that, Ms. Jackson?
Yes, Representative Sweeney. I also have an associate's in human services from Western Nebraska Community College. And since I graduated from there in 2007, and since then, Western Nebraska Community College now offers through their human service program opportunity to get the addiction certification. And I find that really interesting. And so that's just like a couple more classes. And so that's just a couple core classes. And I've exceeded even those classes through my bachelor's. I just find that kind of interesting because I've taken even those classes in my bachelor's through Casper, even in graduate work through Shattering. And it should be more than enough.
Mr. Vice Chairman.
Go ahead, Representative Sweeney.
Thank you for that clarification. And I totally agree with you. And I find it shameful, your treatment.
Further questions for Ms. Jackson? Senator Bouchard.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. I want to thank you, Ms. Jackson, for your testimony. It takes a special heart to go into corrections. Excuse me. I don't know if I can continue to talk. I feel hurt that we keep victimizing people that want to work. I just don't understand. I'm sorry for the emotion, but I get choked up from her testimony. But when are we going to fix this? And I think this is a way to do that and get in the right direction. Thank you. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you, Senator Bouchard. Representative Hallinan, I believe you had a comment. You're muted, Dr. Hallinan.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Ms. Jackson, do you have the 2,000 hours of addiction therapy supervised in your background now? And if you do, then this bill would solve your problem. Do you?
Currently, or President Palmer, currently I have been, okay, I've worked for Gateway Foundation at Wyoming Medium Correctional Institution for a year and a half. I'm currently working as a case manager for them. And I did my practicum through Casper College. I've worked under supervision. There's countless hours. I have to go back and research. If you take 365 days in a year, time, and then the years, I'm sure I have more than enough. And then at other places, I've also done family support work where I've provided drug testing services. So I have to add all of it up.
Thank you, Ms. Jackson. It sounds like you have more than enough. Further questions or comments for Ms. Jackson? No further comments. Thank you again very much, Ms. Jackson, for coming and testifying to us, and good luck in your future endeavors.
Thank you.
Elizabeth, who would we like to talk to next?
Mr. Vice Chairman, we have Frank Craig next.
Very good, admit him in. Mr. Craig, I see your face. I'm waiting to hear your voice. Go ahead, sir.
Mr. Vice Chair, can you hear me?
We can. You're perfect. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, members of the committee. I can't think of a better example than Ms. Jackson's testimony. And the sad part is that she just lacks an elective to complete Casper College's addictions program, and yet she still doesn't seem to satisfy the board requirements for the addiction hours in education. And I would point that back to the NADAC national standards that was referred to, and I believe I did provide a copy of that for the committee for the NCAC2, where it talks about 450 contact hours is what is defined as a national standard, whereas in Wyoming, we're requiring college courses. And in fact, if you added up the college courses, we only have about 380 hours all together, which doesn't even match the equivalent of the 450 at the national level. This bill, and I must apologize to the committee, I did jump the gun a little bit in my previous testimony, and thinking we were going to be taking up both of these bills simultaneously. But what I was proposing in that, it's sort of what this bill speaks to, particularly on page 3 in the paragraphs 4 through 11, when we're talking about supervised work experience and the importance and the vital necessity in that, because we know we don't always get everything we need from just the formal education piece. And that's why on the national standards that they require that supervised work experience. And it does speak specifically in that requirement at NADAC. It characterizes those as 6,000 hours of supervised experience as a substance use disorder addiction counselor. So some of that language that was discussed earlier about how to define that sounded pretty good to me. The NADAC standard 2 at 6,000 hours is in the process of being changed. They are considering lowering those hours because they do recognize that more and more people are presenting with formal college education. In most states that you'll find a sliding scale where that supervised work experience is required. And that's typically dependent on the level of education. So a person with, for example, an associate's degree may be required in certain states a little bit more, in the supervised work area than somebody that maybe has a master's degree. So it really is, to me, I think the 2,000 hours and what I spoke to earlier, if we were able to look at the Kappa, which is our entry level in Wyoming and requires like an associate's degree specific to addictions, and then build on that as that supervised work experience for the person to continue their formal education and achieve that bachelor degree, and then having, 2,000 hours is, I think, is way more sufficient to be able to say they could go test and show competency for the bachelor's level or the CAP. But I appreciate the opportunity to speak to this, and with that, I stand for any questions.
Questions for Mr. Craig, committee? Chairman Scott.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, my question is on page 2, lines 16 and 17. The sentence is, the applicant has received a baccalaureate degree in a human behavioral discipline from a regionally accredited, et cetera. And it says, which meets national standards for accreditation in the field. Do we really need that national standards for accreditation in the field, or would we be better off leaving it as just the applicant has a bachelor's degree in behavioral discipline and then rely on the 2,000 hours in the next paragraph?
Mr. Craig.
Senator Baldwin, co-chair, to that end, when I'm looking at those lines and seeing how it's worded, accreditation in the field of addiction therapy, I would think needs to be reflective of the national standards. And in as much as accreditation for a formal college credit, I think that's where we get a little bit off track in how a particular college course is being reviewed by the committee from the licensing board, whether it's acceptable or not acceptable. If the course is accredited, it is in some cases, hard to find, hard to come by, especially where addictions are concerned. I'm not familiar with what processes there are for a higher education to become certified or accredited in respect to it, but I would think we would want to make sure that the board is following what the national standards reflect, and that being what I said earlier, the difference between what's considered as a contact hour. When I say 450 contact hours, although those have to be approved in addictions at the national level, that could come from a certification program. It could come from multiple CEUs that meet that criteria. It doesn't have to be a college course. And I think that's where people are getting kind of beat down, because they have to go back and enroll in a college and pay tuition and pay for college fees, when it could be possible to obtain that with a lot less financial stress and a lot quicker and still meet the standard. I hope that answered your question.
Further questions for Mr. Craig? Further questions or comments for Mr. Craig? Thank you, Mr. Craig. Oh, go ahead. You got one more thing there.
If I could just clarify one thing too. When we're talking about the 6,000 hours at the NADAC level, please keep in mind that NADAC has an entry-level position that doesn't require any kind of formal education. It's just 270 contact hours plus a high school education. And in respect to achieving their level 2, that's where you're probably seeing a larger requirement for that 6,000 hours, as it's assumed that a person started at the bottom of the ladder with a high school education and the 270 hours and worked up. NADAC does consider certain formal educations as taking place of some of that required 6,000 hours.
Thank you, Mr. Craig. Any further questions? Thank you, Mr. Craig, for your expertise and your explanations. Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Mr. Vice Chairman, we have Andy Somerville next.
Very good. There you are, Ms. Somerville. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. Andy Somerville representing WAMSAC. And so I just want to start by thanking everybody for their work on this bill. I just have a couple of comments similar to, I think, the lines that you guys have already discussed. So on page 2, line 17, in reference to the national standards for accreditation, I believe we like Senator Scott's suggestion that we changed established to accepted by the board. We think that would clear up that technicality in the language. And then later in that paragraph, starting on line 20, it says, in performing its duties under this paragraph, the board shall use the professional training and experience standards of appropriate national professional associations or the standards of an appropriate federal agency. We would suggest that the board consider changing that shall use to consult at this time. We think that NADAC and SAMHSA certainly have the gold standard for addictions therapy. But as was alluded to by Mr. Craig, NADAC is considering some changes, and we would want to give the board time to evaluate those and how they would affect our workforce. And we would also have concerns if we change it for this specific to the CAP, if that would become a concern for the other addiction professionals, mainly the Kappa and the LAT. So that would be our recommendation, to change that to consult, just to bring that in line. Also with Mr. Cyril said about the changes further in the bill. And then the second item we wanted to talk about was on page 3, on line 10. We support putting some sideboards on that supervised work experience. So adding something to the effect that the supervised work experience at the Kappa or equivalent level, that would ensure that the person had what we would consider direct contact, direct client hours, so that they weren't employed in a profession where they weren't or in a position where they weren't having contact with clients. They'd been in a supervised position. They'd worked with, a supervising therapist, and had the chance to develop some of those skills. And then we would also recommend adding that they be required to pass the exam, just to verify that they had those skills. There is a pretty significant difference in the scope of work between a Kappa and a CAP, and that's diagnosis. And so if we're going to rely on the work experience to bring them up to that CAP level, we just want to make sure that they have the skills necessary to perform that full scope of work. Other than that, we don't have any further comments on the bill. I'd be happy to stand for questions.
Thank you, Ms. Somerville. Questions, committee? Go ahead, Senator Schuler.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Yeah, this question is for Andy. On page 3, line 10, I believe Senator Scott mentioned about adding relevant professional after supervised. Would that not be a better fit for that, or better fix by keeping it a little bit more broad than specifying exactly like you did further on in the sentence? Or can you guys live with that, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Ms. Somerville.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. Senator Schuler, I think that we could be okay with that wording. I think the point we're trying to get at is we want to make sure the board has the ability to make sure that that work experience is relevant to that piece. So if that wording gives the board sufficient guidance to be able to use their best judgment on that, then I think we would be okay with that. We're just in general looking for some sideboards.
Further questions or comments for Ms. Somerville? If not, thank you very much, Ms. Somerville. We appreciate your testimony again. Elizabeth, who's up?
Mr. Vice Chairman, we have our final presenter is Ms. Lindsay Simino.
Very good, admitted. Lindsay, I believe you're here. If you are, go ahead.
I
Ms. Sindel.
am.
Go
I
ahead and tell
am.
us what
That
you've got to tell us.
that delay increases throughout the day. Hello, this is, thank you, Vice Chair. This is Lindsay Semino with the Wyoming Counseling Association. I just wanted to inform the committee that we've worked, the Wyoming Counseling Association has worked very closely with WAMSAC when it comes to the suggestions and amendments that Ms. Somerville made today. And we are in support of all of those. We do like the suggestion of adding the word consult on that line 20. We do like Senator Scott's suggestion for page 2, line 17. And so we want to communicate to the committee that there has been discussion before today, that there has been some working together, and we are in support of this moving forward.
Thank you very much, Ms. Semino. Any questions for Ms. Semino, committee? Seeing no hands, you're off the hook, Ms. Semino. Thank you very much for your.
Lovely.
Thank you.
You have a good day.
Are there any further public comment?
Mr. Vice Chairman, I do not have anybody else on the list.
Very good. My screen changed there for a second. Now it didn't. Committee, having heard all public comment, Senator Scott, go ahead.
Chairman, I move that we introduce this bill as a committee bill in the general session.
Very good. Do we have a second? Senator Schuler seconds that. We have a first and a second. Committee, do we have any amendments or discussion on the bill? Co-Chairman Wilson, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. I do have 3 amendments, and I think Senator Scott had one, but I'll let him carry that. The first one is on page 2, line 20, to delete the word use and insert the word consult. Would you like me to do them one at a time or in a bulk?
Let's go ahead and just do them one at a time, because if there's not much discussion, I think we can just knock them out.
Okay. That's
Any discussion on that amendment, committee? Representative Sweeney, go ahead. Our second. I need a second on the amendment first, Representative Sweeney. Do I have a second on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I second.
Okay, go ahead, Representative Sweeney. We have a second by Senator Scott.
So I can appreciate the idea. I am concerned about the amount of discretion the board already has. And in most cases, I think that's good, but my comment is on some of these issues, I'd like to keep some of these things a little narrower. That's my only comment.
Thank you, Representative Sweeney. Further comments or discussion? Co-Chairman Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. As I understood it, the thought behind changing use to consult is that because we list appropriate national professional associations or standards of an appropriate federal agency, they may not all be exactly the same. And that in that case, the board would have to parse between a couple of different options. You know, supposing that the Federal Bureau of Prisons said 3,000 of something and CMS said 2,400, or, you know, something like that. So I think that I understand Representative Sweeney's thought, but I think that that was the issue.
Thank you, Representative Wilson. Further discussion or questions? Senator Bouchard.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. I mean, couldn't we address that by saying respective standard or something of that nature? I mean, I think we need to keep both sides honest, similar to what I said in one of my other arguments. I mean, I think some of the problems that we've seen in testimony today, it just really comes back, and why I lost it is because Representative Sweeney had a person in his district that was, I mean, I think even more victimized by the way this works, and they had all the training in line. I just don't want to get to where we slip out here and allow other no's, other ways to say no. So maybe shall seek the opinion of, or something of that nature. I mean, I just want to make sure that we keep it narrow here somehow and not allow another no.
Thank you, Senator Bouchard. Further discussion or comments on that notion? With no further comments, the motion on the floor is on page 2, changing use to consult. I believe, is that correct, Co-Chairman Wilson? That is correct. Without further discussion, all those in favor of this amendment, please raise your hands to confirm aye. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I believe that passes. Thank you. We'll ask for the negatives. Let's go ahead and ask for the no vote as well, so we confirm that. Those not in favor, raise your hand, please. 1, 2, 3. Thank you very much. Okay, Senator or Co-Chairman Wilson, you have another amendment, I believe.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. 2 more. On page 3, line 10, after the words supervised work experience, insert as a certified addictions practitioner assistant or equivalent.
Very good. LSO, you have that. Is there any discussion on this amendment? Any discussion on the proposed amendment set by Representative Wilson? With no discussion, let's go ahead and vote on this amendment. All those in favor of this amendment? On line 10, to add the prescribed words that Representative Wilson gave us, please raise your hand in favor. Hands up in the air. I can barely see them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All those opposed? 1, 2, 3. That amendment passes. And actually it was 9, not 8. Co-Chairman Wilson, your next amendment,
Mr. Vice
please.
Chair, last one, on page 3, line 11, after the words addiction therapy, insert, and having passed an examination as required under 3338-106 NV. And what that is the Kappa exam. So this, I'm not just plucking this out of my head. There was a suggestion that if the person was using these hours and such like that, that they ought to have at least had to pass the same exam that you would request, that you would require to be a Kappa. And what that says in statute now is the applicant has demonstrated knowledge in the fields of addiction treatment in general by passing a standard examination. The board may develop, adopt, administer, and so on. Anyway, so that's the paragraph 5 of that subsection, and that's a current one. So I just moved that over to specify basically the same exam. So, I mean, if you took the exam already to be a Kappa, you already took it, as far as I'm concerned.
Mr. Brody, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. The committee may want to take into consideration that paragraph C3 of this part of the statute still requires that the applicant, or excuse me, C5 requires that the applicant take a certain test. And if the intent of the committee is to have them take a test for a lower type of certification, we may want to accept out paragraph 5 in the same way that this subsection, or excuse me, paragraph accepts out paragraphs 3 and paragraph 6.
Go ahead, Chairman Wilson.
So, Mr. Chairman, thank you. So this was an amendment that I brought in from input that came into me. Whether there's some difference in those exams or whether they just didn't notice the exam requirement, I don't know. So I will be glad to hear from other people. We may need to bring back some of the public testimony.
Representative Stivar, I believe you have a comment.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if it's the CAP or the Kappa exam, because there's probably two different exams. That's what I would like to know. Hold on a second. Let me go back here.
Okay. Do we need to bring back in Mr. Searles by chance? He can help us out with this. Mr. Searles, I know you're not far away. Are you there, Mr. Searles?
I'm here. Can you hear me? Because there I am.
We can hear you and now we can see you.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Can you run the question by me one more time? Because I'm not sure I fully understood the question.
Chairman Wilson, can you go ahead and paraphrase that for him, please?
Okay, so I was attempting to amend in at the end of that new paragraph 7, an examination requirement, and I inserted in the examination requirement of the Kappa because we had just said that they had to work 2,000 hours as a Kappa or equivalent. And the reason I was doing that was because I received an email from, you folks, not you particularly, but suggesting that under the supervised experience, we ought to add clarification that an exam is required. However, LSO is pointing out that under the existing CAP statute, it requires an exam. So I'm almost wondering whether we maybe don't actually, that would not be voided by a person applying under paragraph 7, I don't think. So perhaps we don't actually need the examination language at all. Anyway, did that clear it up for you? Clear as mud?
Go ahead, Mr. Searles.
Mr. Co-Chair Wilson, yes, it's as clear as mud, but yeah, as long as the exam's required at the CAP level, because this is a CAP certification, if LSO is saying that paragraph 5 still applies, that requires the examination, I believe that satisfies the comment that the exam is required and no further changes would be necessary.
Thank you, Mr. Searles. Senator or Representative Wilson, you're going to be a senator yet today. Go ahead.
So, Mr. Vice Chair, unless we hear otherwise, I think I may withdraw that amendment because I think perhaps paragraph 5 is still there, but there may be someone yet who wants to weigh in on that.
Thank you, Chairman Wilson. Anybody on the committee wish to weigh in or wish her to change that to withdraw? I see no hands coming up. Would you wish to withdraw that, Co-Chairman Wilson?
I would wish to withdraw that.
Oh, Representative Stivar has a comment for us. Go ahead.
No, I think it needs to stay in, and it needs to be, like Mr. Sherrill says, CAP, not Kappa.
Representative Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. The thing is that, so, and I've got the statute book open in my lap, which I appreciate most of us do not. So we are amending paragraph C, which is the CAP requirement. And things that are not in the bill, because we're not touching on them, are the applicant has reached the age of majority, the applicant has no felony convictions. Then we are amending the baccalaureate degree. We are not amending the applicant has demonstrated knowledge by passing a standard exam. So it's not in the bill, but it's still in statute. We're not amending 6 months grace period. And then we're adding this 7, saying that you can use a different kind of degree and 2,000 hours. But it does seem to me that paragraph 5, because we are not deleting it and it's all under this particular profession, paragraph 5 still exists and they will be required to take that exam like any other CAP applicant.
Thank you, Representative Wilson, and I concur. As long as that's in 5, I believe that requirement remains. Representative Stivar, go ahead.
Withdraw.
Withdrawn. And Chairman Wilson, I believe you withdrew that amendment. Is that correct? Thank you very much. Chairman Scott, I believe you had an amendment.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, much simpler amendment, page 2, line 18. Remove the word established and insert the word accepted. Mr. Chairman, I've moved that amendment and explained that I think that as a matter of the English language, the board is right that they aren't establishing the national exam. They're picking which one to accept. And I think this is just really a grammatical correction that they've asked for.
Agreed. Do we have a second to that amendment? Do we have a second? Senator Pappas seconds. Any discussion on that amendment? Not seeing any hands. We'll take a vote on that amendment, which was on page 2, to change established to accepted. All in favor of that amendment, please raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That amendment passes. Are there any further amendments for this bill? Any further proposed amendments for the bill? Any further discussion before we call for the vote?
Question on the
Question being called. John, would you like to go ahead and call the roll, please?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. This is on 21 LSO 186 as amended for introduction in the general session by the Labor Committee. Vice Chairman Baldwin.
Aye.
Senator Bouchard.
Aye.
Senator Pappas.
Aye.
Senator Schuler.
Aye.
Representative Barlow.
Excused.
Representative Clem.
Excused.
Representative Dayton Selman.
Aye.
Representative Hallinan.
Aye.
Representative Roscoe.
Aye.
Representative Stibar.
No.
Representative Sweeney.
Aye.
Representative Yin.
Aye.
Co-Chairman Scott.
Aye.
Co-Chairman Wilson.
Aye.
Motion has been adopted.
Co-Chairman Wilson, it's back to you.
Thank you, Senator Baldwin, for the baton. I'll try not to drop it on your foot. Okay, committee. I have received an email which points out that as we are somewhat behind, 3 hours and 43 minutes behind schedule, the Department of Health staff for presenting some of these things is petering out a little bit. So committee, I want us to move up the draft legislation on frontier information and statewide health information exchange. They offered to do it for tomorrow, but I think it might be a little bit lengthy. But because we may have people on who signed on specifically for this, I want to at least leave it on today. So what I'm going to do is move the agency updates on previous legislation to tomorrow and go straight into the health information exchange so we can get rid of that, and hopefully we won't be so garrulous this time. So I think that is probably the Department of Health who is going to present on this. Is that correct?
Yes,
Anybody there?
ma'am, that is correct. I'm trying to see if Mr. Johansson's available.
Do they all go home?
I believe Stefan is available.
Committee, while we're signing him in, I just hit send on an email that provides you with a link to the existing Health Information Exchange website at the Department of Health. You won't have time, I hope, to read it all while hearing the testimony, but at least you shouldn't. But there's a lot of information on there that talks about when it was stood up, the various things that we've done over the years to get it going, the board, what kind of information is sent out, and all that sort of thing. So you will have that information to review later on. Let's see, Jesse, are you our presenter on this? Or no, here's Stefan. Okay, we'll probably start with Stefan, huh? Anyway, you guys can organize your show there, but.
Madam Chairman, this is Stefan Johansson with the Department of Health. Hopefully you can hear me. Sorry for the technical difficulties. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Jesse Springer to start us on our presentation on the Wi-Fi system. I'll ask Franz to share our screen. Sorry, we're sharing technology here, and we'll get the presentation pulled up. So Jesse, feel free to go ahead.
Okay, can everyone see the presentation?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, great. Today we're just going to talk about the Wyoming Health Information Exchange. It was a technology project that the legislature gave the Department of Health a few years back. And so this is an update on how that's going and also the need for some potential legislation. So we've, I think, provided some language, but we also have it within the slide deck. Can we go to the next slide? Wi-Fi is the abbreviation that we're going to use, but it's the Wyoming Frontier Information Data Exchange. It serves as Wyoming's statewide health information exchange. This system allows the interchange of prescriptions, lab results, radiology reports, discharge summaries, allergies, basically medical information that's in an electronic health record at your provider to be interchanged with one of your other providers. This gets into care coordination on all those type of things, but basically when a provider has your full picture of healthcare, they can give you better care. And so this is the idea that if you get admitted or discharged or transferred from a facility, your primary care physician could know that and reach out to you, or see your lab results electronically, all sorts of things. All 50 states have at least one health information exchange. Some states actually have multiple health information exchanges. Colorado, I think, has multiple. Texas has multiple. So a few states have multiple HIEs. And this was 49 states, but Montana went, as far as we understand, is going live this week. So we updated this to have that information. So some use cases, like why do we even want this system? Why do we build this system in the first place? It allows, if you're in an accident, information about your allergies, blood type, drug interactions, drugs that you might be prescribed, prior care, so that if a test's already been run, they can get the results from that test sent to them versus rerunning the same test. All sorts of things like that that are kind of making sure your care has been provided, with some continuity. For telehealth, it's really been essential so that providers can get each other's records electronically. So our signups during the last year have been very high, especially as a lot of offices have moved to like a fully electronic remote footprint. This has really been helping the practices with that. Efficiency and reduced costs of maintaining the paper files, faxing files, those type of things, sending between your providers. I kind of talked about this again, but trying to, before a provider actually reruns a test, checking if you've had that test, if they see that you have had that test recently, getting those results before they rerun it. And depending on the test, that could be thousands of dollars. So that's a big one. Patient access to their own data. So you can ask your provider for a summary of your own care and see what basically what we call continuity of care document. You could have the provider print that for you or provide that to you, however they're able to. And then patient ease in transferring those records. If you've recently tried to transfer records, in some cases, it can be cumbersome. Some providers actually charge to transfer records electronically. So this is trying to get away from those type of things. Going back to the history, so in 2017 in the budget bill, there was a footnote. You can read the footnote, but it allocated $1 million of general funding. We pursued and were able to receive federal funding approval. So that leveraged another $9 million of federal money. The Department of Health conducted a competitive request for proposal process in 2017. The contract to the Whitting proposer, which is Health Catalyst now, originally was Medicity, but it's all one company. They've just done some mergers. That was executed at the end of 2017. And then our rules were adopted in 2019, trying to give additional context to what the system could do. We went through the rule promulgation process before we had data flowing through it. So the technology rollout was completed in 2018. Provider onboarding has been going very quickly in 2020. We're well ahead of where we thought we would be. So as of 10/1, we have 1,151. Our goal for the whole year of 2020 was 1,000 providers that we had set with our vendor. The total number of organizations that are enrolled is 382. We have 1,151 individual users. 426 of those are at data contributors, and 725 are at view only. So those organizations log in through a website and can view the continuity of care document. Those are providers that either haven't want to join as a data contributing organization, or they're very small. Some of them may not have electronic medical record systems, but they still have an interest in seeing those records and using them in your care. So they log in and just use a website to do that. Some providers are also using direct secure messaging. So that's like an email service. So they can securely communicate with each other in a HIPAA compliant format. We have built connections with the Colorado HIE, Carrillo, the Utah HIE, which is called UHIN, and the South Dakota HIE is in process. Colorado and South Dakota use similar technology as Wyoming. So those have been a bit easier to do. And then we have a lot of care that actually flows into Utah. So those were, Colorado and Utah were priorities, so that when somebody goes to acute care setting or one of those major centers, either in Denver or Salt Lake City, that that care can flow back to Wyoming and be able to be seen. Okay, we can go. So far, and if anybody is interested, they could follow the link here. This https://wifi.solutions is the website that we've built for Wi-Fi that's separate from the Department of Health website. This link has a map and has a lookup service, so you can see any provider that's currently contributing, but some major ones are listed here. We have a number of other providers actually in process statewide. So by the end of October, there'll be a number of other hospitals, including Jackson and Casper will be covered most likely. So we have Campbell County that is very close to going live.
Jesse, if I can pause you here, I
Sure.
see that, oops, sorry, hang on, I'm trying to manage all of this here. I believe I have, well, at any rate, my computer, which is smarter than I at the moment, says that Representative Sweeney waves his hand. Although I don't see a blue hand. Representative Sweeney, are you trying to ask a question?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I think Jesse just answered it. I was curious why the Wyoming Medical Center had not participated, but if you believe they're going to come online, that's good.
I think they've been working very closely with us. We've had a number of people from their organization, their privacy security officer, other people that have participated. They've just been busy with some other things going on in their organization. Otherwise, they were one of our top priorities since they have so much care. But really, the way we've approached this is, as providers are ready, to join, we've been saying, hey, first come, if you're ready, let's get you on board. And we've just been working on those other priority providers as they finish their other projects or they're available. But Wyoming Medical Center is committed to join and is very deep in that process. And we have a number of others that aren't shown here, but it'll cover most hospitals in the state by the end of the year.
Okay, thank you.
So I think we have about a third of the hospitals right now. By the end of the year, I think we'll have about 2/3 of the hospitals. It's a little deceiving when you see this hospital because each of these also has a provider network. And if they're also using the same instance of the electronic health record, then those medical offices are also joining when the hospital joins. So sometimes the hospitals, as they join, it's been a larger project because we were going to first do the hospitals and then do the medical practices. But what we discovered as we went through this is we actually, in most counties, a lot of the practices are actually attached to the hospital. So we've been onboarding them all at once. So it's just a larger training effort, and I'm trying to get through that. And we can provide a timeline of those others if needed.
No, that's great. Thank you.
Okay. The Wi-Fi privacy and security, given the type of data that we're exchanging here between providers, it's just a really sensitive system. So this is really subject to the highest level of HIPAA, and our privacy security officer, our privacy officer is heavily involved. Director's office is heavily involved in making sure this is happening the way, in a safe way, protecting the data. So we've developed policy and procedure manual that's available on our website. So it's trying to cover as many scenarios as possible. We went through other states' policies and procedures and tried to capture as many things that we might not have experienced yet, but so that we have a policy and procedure for when that occurs, provider notice and opt-out, and then audit and training of providers. So there's certain data that's not in the system. Mental health notes, substance abuse information, genetic testing data. Also, we just have not been enrolling mental health providers as data contributing organizations or substance abuse providers. So at this point, we're not looking for this data to be transmitted, but we're also not reaching out to those organizations as data contributing organizations. Some of them are joining as viewers because it is helpful for a psychiatrist to see your medical history before they prescribe you a medication, but it's not working the other way around because there's a lot of concerns about the privacy of that data, and there's different federal laws involved.
Jesse, along those lines, Jesse, because I had remembered that there was something about no mental health and substance use, and have been kind of looking around on the website and didn't see it. Seeing as this was really a budget footnote, clearly that's not in statute. Was that just an internal policy decision? Does that have, is there some sort of federal regulation on that? What's the origin of that decision?
So it's really both. So federal law really sets limits on certain providers cannot share their information. So those providers, there's some bright lines around substance abuse specifically, that those providers they couldn't really join this type of system. Based on that, and then also just a lot of concerns we've heard, and there's a lot of provider groups. So there was multiple stakeholder groups that we've had throughout this process, and we still have an executive committee primarily composed of providers. There's a lot of sensitivity to that, and we had mental health providers in that group, and at this point, they just did not want that data shared. So it's not a permanent decision, but it's a decision that I think is fixed until, if the legislature said, yes, we want to exchange that data, it could technically be done. But I think from our provider executive group and just from all the providers that we've heard, they just didn't want to exchange that data at this time. They thought it was just too sensitive for this type of system. So that's why we've avoided it.
Okay, thank you.
And that's really our status quo, and we're not really pursuing it. So we in our policies and procedures and other things are really trying to avoid that type of data, given that it's very sensitive. That also gets into some of the prohibited uses, marketing, research, fundraising, health insurance underwriting. So those are uses that we think are kind of inconsistent with why the provider would have shared the data or why the patient would want their data to be shared. We're not allowing the data to be used for those purposes. And then the agencies conducted a privacy impact assessment, and that's available on the WDH website as well. And can be provided to the committee if desired. So we've really been trying to make the Wi-Fi opt-out as easy as possible. So we've heard some concerns from people that, I don't want to be a part of the system. I don't, my privacy is more important to me than whatever benefits were on the early sites there. That, that's their privacy is that's the most important thing to them. And so we've tried to make it as easy as possible for people to opt out. The opt-out model is the predominant model in most states. The opt-in models, there's 8 states with that model. Most of those states were the very early health information exchanges. Most of the newer health information exchanges have formed around the opt-out model, generally because it just works much better. You get a lot more data to exchange, more people are actually participating. And some states that were opt-in actually transitioned to opt-out, such as Vermont. So Vermont actually made that transition in 2019 because they were just struggling to actually make the system work to the goals that they had under an opt-in model. So any patient or any person really in Wyoming that wants to opt out of this, if they're a state resident, can do that. I mean, really anybody can opt out, but I don't know why anybody that's not a state resident would. So on our the link there, if you go there, there's a form, and we have a dedicated email address to take those opt-out forms, and our staff will opt out anybody who wants to opt out immediately. Some states have other barriers like requiring a notarized form or anything like that. We're just allowing an opt-out form, and we're trying to make this actually easier. We're looking at doing an online form, but we've heard concerns from people that they don't want to participate. The easiest way to opt out, though, is if your provider is participating. You can mention this to your physician or someone at the staff of that provider and ask them in their EHR to mark you as opt-out, and that technically will opt you out of the system. So if we receive an opt-out from any provider on on your information, then we opt you out of completely of the system. So it's not just of that one medical provider or one electronic health record. If we receive an opt-out ever for you, then we opt you out completely of the system. So there's two ways to do that with your provider directly or sending us a form. And we're just trying to make that form as easy as possible. Any questions on this before we move on? Okay. On the need for a statute, so this was originally authorized as a budget footnote. There are currently no governing statutes. And so we have a sustainability work group that's made of providers and our state staff. And it's highlighted the need to ability to collect and retain revenues. I think that was always a plan that this function would collect and retain revenues. At this point, if we don't have authority to collect revenues, but if we did collect them, they would revert to the general fund after each biennium. And what we see as providers, hospitals mainly, but also other types of providers making contributions and wanting those contributions to be used for the investment of this system. Participation is optional providers. There's no state law requiring participation. So fees would need to be set at a reasonable level, not to discourage participation. The fees are not developed at this time, and we're not suggesting that we actually start collecting fees yet. They would need to be sent to our Wi-Fi executive committee for review and approval, and then promulgated in rule before any provider would be assessed a participation fee. This is just setting, I think, the legal framework for fees, or so a little bit more self-sustainability for this function. This has all been funded either through general fund or through federal funds. And that funding has limits. So to make sure this is a continuing, ongoing function, this is something that we're suggesting. Any question here? Okay. So then the statute language that we've requested, it's a very simple statute. So it's basically establishing the function in state law and then allowing the collection of reasonable participation fees. Chairman Wilson, I could read the statute suggested language if you like, or if that'd be helpful. I'm sorry, you're muted, Chairman Wilson.
Sorry, you may as well go ahead and read it, because there may be some people who are listening who are not able to see the screen for some reason, so.
A, the Department of Health shall have the authority to establish and operate a statewide health information exchange to support the secure exchange of electronic health information for the residents of Wyoming. B, the Department of Health may charge reasonable participation fees. Fees shall be established by rule or regulation promulgated in accordance with Wyoming Administrative Procedures Act. Fees shall be established in an amount sufficient to recoup the department's cost of providing services. And fees collected by the department pursuant to this section shall be credited to a special revenue account.
Jesse, did you not feel any need to, I mean, I see that you have the whole, you know, the executive committee and policy, or, you know, whatever, the existing infrastructure for that. Is there any part of what that executive committee and such like does, or how it exists, that needs to be in there in addition to just establishing and operating the exchange? Or would you consider that to all be under your rulemaking authority and you would just do it anyway?
It's a good question. I mean, you could establish the executive committee or the governing committee or advisory committee and set its powers. In statute, we've seen it multiple ways that those are advisory, they're established by rule, or they're actually established by statute with dedicated members. So the legislature has actually weighed in to say there will be this many of this type of member and this many of this type of member. At this point, there's 2 department health representatives, and the rest of the executive committee is composed of providers or provider associations. This is one of the operations that is in the unit that I'm managing, and we've intentionally tried to limit how many Department of Health individuals are on the advisory group, since if we put too many Department of Health individuals, it kind of overcomes the point of having an advisory group. But yeah, that would be I think a fine point. And if that was a request, we could provide language. We've over the course of a year, we've developed multiple versions of this, but this was, I think, the most straightforward to the actual need at this point, which is that, especially given possible budget cuts and other kind of revenue constraints of the state, the ability to set this on some sort of financial footing.
Okay. Questions for Mr. Springer? Senator Scott.
Madam Chairman, I must say I very much support the minimalist approach that this legislation is proposed. My question for Mr. Springer, would it be useful to have a sentence possibly as a subsection C that authorized the department to establish rules in the operation of the exchange as becomes necessary, something to that effect, and just a simple rulemaking authority provision?
Mr. Springer.
Chairman Wilson, Chairman Scott, that's a good point. I understood that rulemaking authority was already implied when you create a program. I'm not sure about that I would have to defer to, honestly, to lawyers. I'm not real sure, but I think, we have promulgated a rule, and we do intend to continue to refine those rules so that privacy and security especially are established in a rule, because just the handling of this data, that's why we promulgated a rule in advance, is that we're handling sensitive data. So we wanted to make sure that the rules were there in case of appeal generally. So we had a process for if someone wanted to appeal the handling, there would be a process.
Chairman Scott.
So you feel you've already established rules and you feel you have the legal authority to do that. So we don't really need to add that to the bill then. That would make it a lot simpler.
Any other questions for Mr. Springer? Representative Yin.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Springer, I was wondering how much of the $10 million from that original allocation is left or has been expended, and is there still money for that to be used as runway before we set up for fees, or how is the program being funded right now?
Mr. Springer.
I'll have to provide the specific expenditures separately after the meeting. We have sufficient funding currently to take us through September 2021, mainly because the funding is 90% federally funded through that date. We're working to actually make additional federal funding. So that really the sustainability of this depends on whether we're able to get continued 90% or 75% federal funding. It is funded through September 2021. And we have a contract running through that date. But after that date, we've worked through like how much it actually costs to operate, and we're working. It's a bit odd because we've been at such a high expenditure rate through implementation that it'll be a much lower expenditure when we're actually in operations and maintenance.
Madam Chairman.
I'm sorry, Senator Scott.
Madam Chair.
You're muted, Senator Scott.
My comment is, as you work your fees going forward with the operation, be warned that these things always require maintenance, and be sure you set the fees and the expected federal money such that you do cover that. I've heard a figure of 20%. I don't know whether the experts say anymore or not. Used to be reasonable. My question is, it would seem that since the purpose of this legislation is to enable you to collect and use a fee, my thought is that so you could get started on developing them right away, that an immediate effective date would be appropriate. Is that what you have in mind?
Chairman Wilson, Co-Chairman Scott, that would be helpful. So it's helpful for both the revenue collection standpoint, but also the special revenue account. So if we get a special revenue account, we could pursue other grants. So foundations, other types of grants that are for data and connectivity, and save those funds in a special revenue type account that doesn't revert at the end of the biennium. So that might help us start collecting now a small fee that could be saved for when federal funding is lower. That's the idea of why a general fund account I don't think would work quite as well than having a dedicated account for this purpose.
More questions for Mr. Springer? Committee, I will just say, I know that there have been, I've seen some concerns about data privacy and all that, which in some ways, since the age of the computer, are probably the horse was out of the barn about 30 years ago. But I'll just say, I noticed myself here in Cheyenne to be sitting in my nurse practitioner's office and have her say, well, let me just look up and see what that last x-ray report said. And for her to be able to get into the, the radiology clinics reports and see that, as opposed to back in the day in the 70s or the 80s, where you had to go in and make a request and pay money and then carry x-rays in an envelope to your other provider or something. I mean, I have to say the ability of a provider to actually access the things that you've had done somewhere else is so huge. It's really great. Obviously, they need to pay attention to the HIPAA issues and the cybersecurity issues. I mean, that's certainly critical, but the need to not have your provider say, well, we didn't get those x-rays, so we're going to order another $300 set, and then have your insurance company say, well, we're not paying for that because you already did one 2 months ago. Boy, I think that there's a lot of value to that. Okay, and that was my little added advertisement. Any other questions for Mr. Springer? So, Mr. Springer, do you have anything other that you want to present, other than to hope that we have a motion on the bill?
Chairman Wilson, just thank you for allowing this to be a topic this meeting.
Very good. I do think it fits into our assigned management topic of costs of healthcare. Chairman Scott.
Madam Chairman, when appropriate, I'm going to move that we have the LSO draft a bill for our consideration next time. It obviously needs to be in proper bill form with an effective date, all that sort of thing. Is there any public comment we need to deal with before?
Thanks. Well, I'm really slacking off. Any public comment?
Madam Chairwoman, we had a few individuals, but they have since left the meeting. We do have Eric Boley as the last individual of the evening.
All right, he's a hardy sort. Send him in. Mr. Boley, good job sticking with us.
Madam Chairman, committee members, Eric Boley, Wyoming Hospital Association. I appreciate your time today. I actually serve on the executive committee for the Wi-Fi, also on some of the subcommittees, and I'm here in support of this proposed legislation. We've worked really hard over the years. I was actually one of the members of the original HIE. A lot of great work was done then, but it was unsustainable. We've come a long way. Hospitals are actively involved and are signing up quickly to get engaged and working with the HIE. But there are some concerns about sustainability, and we've come up with a sustainability model that would actually charge end users an annual fee. This legislation would actually protect that money and make sure that we are sustainable into the future. We've made great strides, but I'm just here in support of that in hopes that we can move something forward so that we feel secure as we move forward with the HIE into the future. The other thing I'll let you know is I'm with you. We're working actively to try to come up with ways to save cost, and by utilizing the HIE, if providers will trust the information that's shared within the HIE, we can cut down on some of the duplicative testing. We can find ways to do better with continuity of care. There are a lot of benefits that come through the use of the HIE, and we're seeing a huge uptick in utilization. So with that, I'd answer any questions, but again, just encourage movement with this legislation, and thank you for your time.
So Eric, for a sort of an average hospital in Wyoming, I don't know how many beds average would be. We have sort of a strange distribution, but you know, a 20, 40, 60 bed hospital or something. What kind of fee are we looking at?
Madam Chairman, I think that's a great question. And we've taken a look at a couple of different sustainability models for critical access hospitals, which are 25 beds or less. And Jess, you can jump in here if I go off the rails, but my recollection, without looking at it, I think it's around $7,000 a year. For our larger PPS hospitals, it's I think it's around 30,000, which is not really out of line with what we see in other states. The UHIN, which is the Utah Hospital or Utah Health Information Network, that $30,000 figure is right in line with what they're doing. The one thing that's different in most other states is there are a lot of facilities, whereas we're dealing with our 30 hospitals and then physician clinics. I also think with Carrillo, which is the Colorado Health Information Exchange, that $30,000 figure for PPS hospitals, it might be a little bit higher, but again, you're dealing with economies of scale. And then I think if I remember right, for physician practices, private practices, it's around $500 per. And then we also, in our sustainability model, the state Medicaid, because there's great benefit for the Medicaid population, they're chipping in. We're also relying on some of our partners in the insurance industry to help sustain this, because again, it'll help drive down the costs that they're expending as long as the HIE is used properly. So I think that's right. Jesse, is that close?
Jesse?
Much better than if I did it. Great job.
So then, Mr. Boley, one other question is just, I don't want you to give away any secret details, but you know, for people as far as concerns about data privacy and you know, cybersecurity and all that, I mean, other than opting out, how different would this HIE be than just the hospital system, IT systems that we have already, like when we saw, you know, not quite a year ago with Campbell County and, you know, St. John's, various hospitals hacked in. So is this basically the same type of system and vulnerabilities that we see already? Are there more layers of security, or just talk through that a little bit?
Well, you might be above my pay grade here, but I'll try. So, Madam Chairman, you know, there are inherent risks always when it comes to health information exchanges, whether it's through an EMR or through an HIE. My understanding, though, is that the securities that are built into this HIE are state of the art. We haven't gone out and bargain shopped as far as our partners are concerned. And the HIE that we've had developed is by a company that's set up other HIEs around the country. And so my feeling is that we probably have the very best security that we possibly could, but none of it's infallible. There's always that opportunity. We just had another cyber attack in our hospital systems around the country just recently. And the hackers are great at what they do. They find ways in, but I feel secure in the fact that we've tried to mitigate and do all we can to create the most secure HIE we possibly could.
Other questions for Mr. Boley? Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks, Madam Chairman.
Elizabeth, it was only Mr. Boley?
Yes, ma'am, that is correct.
Okay, so public testimony is closed. Co-Chairman Scott, I think it's back to you for your motion.
Madam Chairman, I move that we request the LSO staff to put in proper Wyoming bill draft form, a bill that's based on the text that the Health Department has given us with an immediate effective date.
Is there a second? Seconded by
Second.
Sweeney. Any discussion? Senator Scott.
Madam Chairman, I think the proposed bill has virtue of being quite simple. It is in good part a fundraising measure, so it'll probably have to start in the House. The concern that we will probably hear is on the data security. And I think there's two things we will need to say on the floor on that. One, starting with the federal HIPAA law, there's been a lot of law developed that we're going to have to comply with anyhow. So we probably don't need to reinvent the wheel on that score. They're well controlled by existing privacy laws. Second, the opt-out gives system they've used gives people that are concerned about that the ability to keep out of it, but I think it'll save most people enough money that people won't want to opt out, most of them. But that and the policy they developed of not including the mental health things, which again is in response to some existing federal legislation in the privacy area. I think all those take care of that particular argument, and we're safe proceeding with.
Oh, you just muted somehow. I would unmute you myself if I could, but I evidently can't, so. LSO, are you able to unmute the chairman?
Madam Chair, no, but is it possible for him to hit his space bar to unmute himself?
Try that, chairman. Ah,
Madam
there you
Chairman, can you hear me now?
are. I can hear you, yes.
Yeah, I'm afraid the problem is low bandwidth at this end, and that's not something we can deal with. That's why you're chairing. That happens to me. So, Madam Chairman, I think the bill is in good shape. And if we put it forward, then we'll give everybody a chance to comment on it at the next meeting.
Okay, so committee members, if we agree to this, then you will have an actual bill in the November meeting to look at if you feel the need to make further changes. Is there any other discussion about this request to LSO? Okay, then if you're in favor of having the bill drafted along the lines of the item on this page, please raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Okay, 11. All right. Any opposed? I saw Representative Hallinan's hand by, oh, there he is, 1. Okay, 1. And we have 2 excused. So, LSO, any questions on that?
No, Madam Chairman, thank you.
Okay. So it's 5:30. We are just not going to take on the agency updates tonight. We will add them in tomorrow somewhere with the promise that everyone has to not talk too much tomorrow. All right, LSO, before we adjourn for the recess for the day, do you have any news for the good of the order?
Madam Chairwoman, we would like to know, just to note for those who are listening still to the stream, once we figure out those times, we will be sending emails out to anyone who signed up for public comment. So they will have the new time once that is decided.
Yes, and our apologies to anyone who might have signed up. I appreciate, I think there were quite a number on the drug importation study. Apologies for that. If you are a longtime viewer of the Labor Committee, you know that we're just sadly garrulous in that way. And you really didn't want to be here until 9 o'clock tonight anyway. So with that said, we will recess until tomorrow morning at 8:30. All right, enjoy your evening.
Madam Chairwoman.